Margaret Hayes slammed the letter down on her work table so hard the scissors jumped. Too old. She said the words out loud because saying them out loud was the only way to make herself believe someone had actually written them. A man she had never met. A man who had seen her name, learned her age, and decided 30 years of living made her worthless before he even looked at her face. She stood there in her shop hands trembling and made a decision that would change everything. If this story speaks to your heart, subscribe to our channel and follow every part until the end, and drop a comment telling us what city you're watching from. I want to see how far this story travels. The letter had come on a Tuesday. That was the detail Margaret would remember later, when she tried to piece together the exact moment her life cracked down the middle and let something new grow through. Not a Sunday when the town gathered and the air smelled like church soap and fresh-baked bread. Not a Saturday when Willow Creek's main street filled with ranchers and merchants and the comfortable noise of people who belonged somewhere. A Tuesday. A forgettable, ordinary Tuesday in the summer of 1883, when the Colorado sky was so blue it almost hurt to look at, and the dust on the road outside her shop window hung gold in the afternoon light, like something beautiful that didn't know it was about to be disturbed. She had been mending a pair of trousers for old Fletcher Grady when Clara Whitmore walked in. Clara was the kind of woman who delivered bad news the way some people delivered gifts, with a particular brightness in her eyes and a smile that never quite reached the edges. She was 2 years younger than Margaret, already on her second husband, already mother to 4 children, and she wore her respectability like a pressed Sunday dress she never took off. She and Margaret had known each other since girlhood. They were not friends exactly, but they were too entangled in the small web of Willow Creek's social life to be strangers. "There's a letter for you," Clara said, setting the envelope on the counter with 2 fingers, like it was something she didn't want to touch any longer than necessary. "Came in on the morning post. The postmaster thought I might be passing your way." Margaret set down her needle. She looked at the envelope. Her name was written on the front in a careful, deliberate hand, the handwriting of a man who had learned penmanship from someone who valued it. "Who's it from?" Clara's smile flickered. "A Mr. Thomas Aldrich, out of Denver." Margaret picked up the envelope. She didn't open it yet. She turned it over in her hands and felt the weight of it, the particular density of paper that held words someone had thought about before putting down. "He's a widower," Clara added in the same tone she might use to say he's a blacksmith, or he's from Ohio. Informational, neutral, and yet somehow not neutral at all. 42 years old. His sister is married to Reverend Hooper in Benson County. She's the one who, well, she mentioned your name to him, said you were a hardworking woman, respectable. "That was kind of her," Margaret said. "I thought you'd want to know before you read it," Clara said. And then she paused. Just long enough. The kind of pause that isn't accidental. "He may have some concerns. About your situation." Margaret looked at her. "My situation." "Your age, Margaret." Clara said it softly, like softness made it kinder. 30 as well. Some men have particular ideas about what they're looking for. I'm sure he means nothing personal by it." Margaret nodded once. She kept her face still. She had learned over the years to keep her face very still when people said things like this, because the alternative was showing them something true about herself that she wasn't willing to give away to people who would only use it carelessly. "Thank you for bringing it by Clara." After Clara left, Margaret opened the letter. It was 4 paragraphs long. The first paragraph introduced Thomas Aldrich as a man of property and decent character who was seeking a companion for the second chapter of his life. The second paragraph described his requirements in general terms: a woman of good health, agreeable temperament, and modest expectations. The third paragraph was where Margaret's hands began to tighten around the paper. "I must be forthcoming, Miss Hayes, as I believe honesty serves us both better than pretense. I had hoped to correspond with a woman of younger years. 30 is, and I mean no cruelty in this observation, quite beyond the age at which most men in my position feel comfortable beginning a new family. I am told you are capable and kind, and I do not doubt those qualities. But capability and kindness, while admirable, do not change the practical realities of what a man of my circumstances requires. The fourth paragraph thanked her for her time and wished her well. Margaret read it twice. Then she put it down on the work table and stood there for a long moment looking at nothing. Then she picked up the scissors she'd been using to trim Fletcher Grady's trousers, and she cut the letter into 4 pieces, and she dropped those pieces into the wood stove in the corner of her shop, and she watched them burn. She didn't cry. She hadn't cried over something like this in a very long time, but her hands trembled for the rest of the afternoon. That was the thing people in Willow Creek never quite understood about Margaret Hayes. They thought they knew her. They thought she was the competent widow who ran a clean shop and kept her head down and asked for nothing. They thought she was a woman who had made peace with her circumstances, who had folded her private wants into a small, manageable shape and tucked them somewhere they wouldn't cause trouble. They thought she was content. What she was practiced. There is a difference between contentment and practice. Contentment is something you arrive at. Practice is something you do every single day because the alternative is falling apart, and you cannot afford to fall apart when there are orders to fill, and accounts to keep, and a roof that needs patching before winter, and no one else who is going to do any of those things. Margaret had been practicing for 8 years. She had been 22 when she married James Hayes, and 22 when she understood what it meant to love someone with the particular, slightly desperate love of a young woman who believes she has finally found her footing in the world. James had been a good man. Not a perfect man. No honest person is, but good in the ways that count, in the ways you only recognize fully after they're gone. He worked hard. He was patient. He made her laugh on the days when laughter felt like something she had to remember how to do. He died 19 months after their wedding. A cattle accident, the kind that happens in seconds, the kind that leaves nothing to argue with and no one to be angry at, except the terrible randomness of a life that doesn't ask permission before it takes things from you. Margaret was 24 years old and had a dead husband and a small shop in a town that was in the generous frontier way willing to offer her sympathy for approximately 3 months before it expected her to either remarry or disappear quietly into someone else's household. She did neither. She stayed. She worked. She built something. The shop was hers in the way that very few things in a woman's life in 1883 were truly hers. She had negotiated the lease herself. She paid it herself. She set her own hours and chose her own customers, and decided quietly and without announcement that she was not going to ask anyone's permission to keep existing in the space she had carved out for herself. Willow Creek admired this, for a time. But admiration has a short shelf life when it's directed at a woman who refuses to resolve herself into something more convenient. By the time Margaret was 27, the admiration had curdled into something more complicated. People respected her work. People depended on her for mending, for alterations, for the quiet loans she made to struggling families. When the winter was bad, for the particular kind of reliable, undemanding presence she offered to women who needed someone to talk to who wouldn't repeat what they said. She was useful. She was valued. But she was also increasingly something the town didn't quite know what to do with. She wasn't a wife. She wasn't a daughter living under her father's roof. She wasn't a widow who had grieved and moved on in the acceptable direction. She was a woman who had survived loss and built something from the rubble and seemed to require nothing from anyone, and that made people in Willow Creek more uncomfortable than they wanted to admit. Because a woman who doesn't need saving raises a particular kind of question that most people would rather not ask themselves. If she's fine without a husband, does that mean she was fine without James too? And if that's true, then what does it mean when we say a woman needs a man to be complete? And if it's not true, if she's not fine, if she's lonely in the private way that people only show themselves at 2 a.m. when there's no one else watching, then why does she look so capable? Why does she never ask for anything? What is she hiding? Margaret wasn't hiding anything. She was just being careful. She had learned after a while that the people who asked women like her the most questions weren't really looking for answers. They were looking for confirmation of something they'd already decided. And what Willow Creek had decided sometime around Margaret's 28th birthday was that she had missed her window. The phrase traveled through the town. the way all quiet cruelties travel not in one blow, but in 100 small cuts, each one so minor that you could almost convince yourself you were imagining it. It was in the way Mrs. Alderton at the general store said, "Such a shame you never remarried," every single time Margaret came in for supplies, as if the observation were fresh each time, as if it were a wound that needed regular reopening to stay clean. It was in the way the younger women, the ones who were 19 and 20, and freshly married and terrified of ending up like her, looked at her with a pity that they hadn't yet learned to hide behind politeness. It was in the way that invitations to certain social events stopped arriving, because a single woman of a certain age disrupted the arithmetic of the dinner table, the careful pairing of couples that made respectable society feel ordered and right. And it was in the letters. The letter from Thomas Aldrich had not been the first. There had been others over the years, men who had heard her name from someone, men who were sometimes decent and sometimes not, men who wrote to her with the cautious hope of the lonely, and then discovered her age and withdrew with varying degrees of graciousness. She had learned not to expect too much from those correspondences. She had learned to read them quickly and file them in the stove and return to work. What she had not learned, what she was still learning on that Tuesday afternoon, in the summer of 1883, watching Thomas Aldrich's letter turn to ash, was how to stop minding. She minded. That was the truth she kept most carefully locked away. She minded that the town had decided her story was over. She minded that men she had never met felt entitled to measure her worth against a number and find her lacking. She minded that the same qualities everyone praised in her self-sufficiency, her practical intelligence, her refusal to crumble, were the very things that seemed to make her less in the eyes of the world rather than more. She minded all of it. She just couldn't afford to show it. Samuel Carter rode into Willow Creek on a Thursday. Margaret didn't see him arrive. She heard about it the way you hear about everything in a small town, in pieces, assembled from fragments, the full picture only emerging gradually as more people added their particular corner of the story. What she heard first was that someone had bought the old Danner property on the eastern edge of town. The Danner property had sat empty for 4 years, since old Horace Danner died with no heirs and a significant amount of debt, and the land had gone to the bank, and the bank had been waiting for someone foolish enough or stubborn enough to take it on. The buildings were in poor repair. The fencing was falling down. The water rights were complicated in the way that water rights in Colorado Territory were always complicated, layered and contested, and likely to require a lawyer before they were sorted out. The man who had bought it, she learned next, was from Texas, originally, though he'd spent the last several years moving through the territories. New Mexico, Arizona, briefly, Wyoming, doing ranch work, cattle drives. The kind of life that keeps a man in motion and doesn't give him much time to set roots anywhere. His name was Samuel Carter. He was 35 years old. He was unmarried. That last detail traveled through Willow Creek faster than all the others combined. By the time Margaret heard it from her neighbor Ruth Peoples, who had it from her daughter Ellen, who had heard it at the feed store that same morning, it had already accumulated a set of additional observations and speculations that clung to it like burrs. "They say he's handsome," Ruth told her, leaning against the doorframe of the shop with the particular posture of someone who is pretending to stop by casually, but has actually been waiting to stop by since 7 in the morning. "Not flashy handsome, quiet handsome, the kind that doesn't know it." Said Margaret, not looking up from the seam she was pressing. "Ellen says he bought 4 horses at the stock sale yesterday. Good animals. He knows what he's looking at." Ruth paused. "He had lunch at Nell Patterson's counter. Ate by himself. Didn't talk to anyone, just ate his food and paid and left." "Sounds like a man who wanted lunch," Margaret said. "He's a widower," Ruth said with a particular gentleness that was more pointed than bluntness would have been. "Lost his wife some years back. They say he never will. He's never shown much interest in anyone since." Margaret finally looked up. She met Ruth's eyes with the calm, flat look she had perfected over years of these conversations. "Ruth, I'm just telling you what I heard." "You're telling me because you think I should know there's an eligible man in town?" Margaret said, without heat, without edge, just plainly. "I appreciate the thought. Now let me finish this hem, or Mrs. Greer will be after me by 2 o'clock." Ruth laughed a little flustered and changed the subject. But later, after Ruth had gone and the shop was quiet, Margaret allowed herself one honest moment of acknowledging what she had not let show on her face. She was curious. The first time she saw him was 5 days after he arrived. He came into the shop on a morning when the town was quiet, midweek. Mid-morning, the hour when most people were occupied with work and the main street was left to the heat and the dust, and the particular lazy patience of dogs. Margaret was at her work table, her back partially to the door, when she heard the bell above it ring. She turned. He was standing in the doorway, one hand still on the frame, as if he hadn't quite committed to entering. Taller than she expected, though she couldn't have said why she'd expected anything in particular. His clothes were clean, but worn in the way that work clothes become worn not carelessly, but thoroughly, in the specific places that told you exactly what kind of work he did and how seriously he did it. His hat was in his hand. He had dark eyes and the kind of face that spent a lot of time outdoors, but hadn't become careless about it. There were lines around his eyes, but they looked more like the residue of thought than the residue of sun. "Morning?" he said. His voice was even, not warm, not cold, present. "I was told this is where I could get some mending done." "You were told correctly," Margaret said. She set down her work and turned to face him fully. "What do you need?" He came in committing to the doorway at last and held out a folded piece of canvas. "Work jacket. The seam at the shoulder gave out. Could probably do it myself, but I haven't got a needle strong enough for the canvas." She took it from him and opened it up and looked at the seam. It had not merely given out, it had been repeatedly patched and repatched, each repair outlasting the last, until the fabric itself had grown tired around the thread. The jacket had years of work in it. She could see that. She turned it in her hands and thought about how to tell him what she was seeing, which was that the jacket had maybe one more good repair in it before it became unrepairable. "This is going to hold for another season," she said. "Maybe 2 if you don't push it. But the fabric around the shoulder is weakening. When you start to see fraying about 2 inches from whatever stitch I put in, that's your signal to replace it." He looked at her steadily. "You could just fix it and not say that." "I could," she agreed. "But then you'd be back in 6 months blaming me for a jacket that I knew was going to fail." Something shifted in his face, not quite a smile, but the trace of one like a smile had passed nearby and left a mark. "Fair enough," he said. "How much?" she told him. He didn't negotiate, which she noticed. Some men negotiated as a matter of principle, not because they disputed the price, but because they felt it was expected of them. He just nodded and asked when it would be ready, and she told him 2 days, and he said he'd come back then. He turned to leave. "Mr. Carter," she said. He paused, looked back. "The rope you've got tied to your saddlebag," she said. "If it's as worn as the jacket, you'll want to replace it before it fails somewhere inconvenient." He looked at her for a moment, with an expression she couldn't immediately read. Then he said, "I noticed that myself this morning." "Good," she said. He left. Margaret turned back to her work. Her hands, she noticed, were completely steady. He came back for the jacket on the second day exactly when he said he would. He examined her repair carefully, not with suspicion, but with the focused attention of a man who looked at things properly before deciding what he thought about them. He ran his thumb along the new seam, tested the tension, folded the canvas back the way it would fold in use. "This is good work," he said. "Thank you. You reinforced it here," he said, touching a point an inch below the main seam. "I didn't ask for that." "You didn't need to ask for it," Margaret said. "That's where it would have failed next." He looked at her again with that same unreadable expression. Then he reached for his wallet. "What do I owe you for the extra?" "Nothing. It took 2 extra minutes." He paused. "I don't like charity." "It's not charity," she said. "It's how I do my work. Either it's done right or it's not done. If you want to pay me for 2 extra minutes of thread and time, I'll charge you 3 cents and we'll both feel better about the transaction." The trace of a smile appeared again. 3 cents, he said, and he put 3 cents on the counter with a deliberateness that told her he had a sense of humor even if he wore it quietly. "Mr. Carter," said a voice from the doorway. They both turned. It was Eliza Marsh, the banker's wife, a woman who collected social information, the way other people collected china, standing in the shop entrance with a bundle of her own mending and a brightness in her expression that Margaret recognized immediately as the brightness of someone who has just discovered something interesting. "I didn't realize you'd found the shop already," Eliza said to Samuel with a smile that was technically directed at him, but was actually directed at everything. "Margaret runs the best mending in Willow Creek. You'll find that out quickly." She paused, and the pause was architectural, constructed with purpose. "Has she told you she's been here 8 years, all on her own?" "Mrs. Marsh," Margaret said pleasantly. "It's admirable, truly." Eliza continued, setting her bundle on the counter. A woman managing completely alone all this time. Though of course, and here the pause came again, that carefully placed thing, most of us do wonder, don't we, whether it gets lonely. The shop went quiet. Samuel Carter picked up his jacket from the counter. He folded it over his arm. He turned to look at Eliza Marsh with the same steady, unhurried attention he had given the repaired seam, and something in that attention made Eliza's smile flicker. "I expect," he said, "that a woman who's built something from the ground up and kept it running for 8 years has better things to think about than what other people wonder." He nodded to Margaret, a simple, clean nod, and walked out. Eliza Marsh stood at the counter with her mouth slightly open. Margaret took the bundle of mending and turned it over in her hands and said in her most professional voice, "I can have these back to you by Friday, Mrs. Marsh." Eliza left 3 minutes later. And Margaret stood alone in her shop, and for the first time in a very long time, she didn't know quite what to do with what she was feeling. He came back the following week. Not for mending this time, or not only for mending. He came in with a list written on a piece of paper that he passed across the counter without ceremony, a list of things he needed but wasn't sure where to find in Willow Creek. Some of them she could help with directly. Others she couldn't, but she knew who could. She told him where to find the leather merchant who carried the grade of strap he needed for the harness repair. She told him which of the 2 livery stables in town was more reliable, and which one had recently had trouble with its shoeing. She told him that if he needed help with the water rights dispute on the Danner property, which he would, because everyone who bought that property eventually did, the only lawyer within reasonable distance worth talking to was a man named Holt in the county seat, and she could write him a letter of introduction that would at least get Samuel past Holt's considerable skepticism about strangers. Samuel stood across the counter and listened to all of this and did not interrupt her and did not look at her with the slightly surprised expression that some men wore when a woman demonstrated practical knowledge about things they considered their domain. He just listened. "Why do you know all this?" he asked when she finished. "Because people tell me things when I'm working on their clothes," she said. "You'd be surprised what conversations happen over a hem." "I wouldn't be surprised, actually," he said. "I've noticed that people talk in barbershops the same way." "Similar principle," she agreed. "You know this town better than you let on?" She considered him. "What makes you say I let on anything at all?" He thought about that. "You're careful," he said, "about what you say and to who. It's not—" He paused, finding the word. "It's not shyness. You're not shy. You just decided at some point to keep most of yourself to yourself." Margaret said nothing for a moment. Then she said, "Is that a criticism?" "No," he said. "It makes sense." And he said it in a way that suggested he understood it from the inside, from his own experience of the same particular economy, the decision about what to spend on people who might not be worth the cost. He picked up his list. "I'll take you up on the letter to Holt if you're willing." "I'll have it ready Thursday," she said. He left. Margaret looked at the door after it closed behind him. She thought, that is a man who has been paying close attention. and she thought, I am not sure how I feel about being paid close attention to. Thursday came. She had the letter ready. She had written it on her better paper, the kind she kept for formal correspondence, and she had been more specific in her commendation of Samuel than she usually was in these kinds of introductions, because the more she thought about the water rights situation on the Danner property, the more she thought he was going to need every advantage he could get. Horace Danner had been a difficult man in life, and he remained difficult in death, his affairs so tangled that the County Land Commission had already weighed in twice and resolved nothing. Samuel came in at 9 in the morning, read the letter where he stood, folded it carefully, and put it in his breast pocket. "This is generous," he said. "It's accurate," she said. "I wrote what I believe to be true." "You vouched for a man you've known 2 weeks. I vouched for what I observed in 2 weeks," she said, "which is that you pay your bills on time, you don't negotiate dishonestly, you look at things properly before you judge them, and you say what you mean. That's enough for a letter of introduction." He was quiet for a moment. "Can I ask you something?" he said. "You can ask," she said. "The water rights dispute," he said. "I spoke to 3 men in town about it. 2 of them tried to sell me something. One of them told me I should have known what I was getting into and said no more. But the way you described it last week, you said it was complicated, not impossible." "What did you mean by that?" Margaret turned to the shelf behind her counter and picked up a ledger, not hers, but one she'd been doing bookkeeping entries for as a favor, something she occasionally did for business owners who needed help with accounts. She opened it to a page and pointed to a column of figures. "When I say complicated," she said, "I mean there are 3 overlapping claims, and 2 of them have documentation that predates the third, but the third claim has county registration that the other 2 don't. It's not that the rights don't exist. It's that nobody has gone to the trouble of tracing them back to source and presenting them to the commission properly." She paused. "Holt can do that. It'll take time and money. But it's doable." Samuel looked at the ledger page she was pointing to. Even though it was unrelated to his situation, he was looking at the structure of what she was showing him, the way she thought about problems. She could see that. "How do you know that about the water claims?" he asked. "Horace Danner was a customer for 6 years, she said. "He talked." Samuel nodded slowly. "You said Holt charges." "He charges by the hour, and he'll want a retainer," she said. "But if the primary claim holds the way I think it does, you'll recover more in land value than you spend in legal fees." She paused. "I'm not an attorney. I could be wrong." "You don't think you're wrong?" She looked at him directly. "No," she said. "I don't." He looked back at her with that expression, the one she was beginning to understand was what his face did, instead of smiling, and he said, "Good. I'll trust your read until I have reason not to." He paid for 2 more items she'd had in stock that he needed, thanked her, and left. And Margaret stood in the empty shop and noticed for the first time since she couldn't remember when that she was looking forward to what might happen next. What happened next was that the town noticed. Willow Creek was a place that ran on observation, on the careful accumulation and distribution of small facts, on the reading of patterns, and the drawing of conclusions that were offered and accepted and argued over with a thoroughness that would have done credit to a court of law. Nothing Samuel Carter did was particularly conspicuous. He came into the shop. He asked questions. He listened to the answers. He went away. He came back. But he came back. And that was enough. Clara Whitmore found a reason to stop by the shop on a Wednesday morning 3 weeks after Samuel's arrival, and this time she didn't bring a letter. She brought her mending and a look on her face that Margaret had learned to brace against. "People are starting to talk," Clara said. "People are always talking," Margaret said. "What are they saying this week?" "That you and the Carter man seem to be spending a good deal of time in conversation." "He's a customer," Margaret said. "I've had customers before." "Margaret." Clara set her bundle down and put her hands flat on the counter, and for a moment the performance fell away from her face, and she looked simply like what she was, a woman who had known Margaret for most of her life, and was genuinely uncertain about what she was trying to say. I don't want to see you get your hopes up and then be disappointed." "My hopes," Margaret said, very carefully. "He's new here. He doesn't know what he doesn't know how the town—" Clara stopped, started again. "You're a wonderful woman. I mean that. But you know that men in his position, when they're ready to remarry, they tend to look at younger women," Margaret said. Clara's face shifted. "I was going to say women with fewer." "Fewer what?" The silence stretched. "Clara," Margaret said, and her voice was very even. "What exactly is it that you think I have too much of?" "Years," Clara said, and the word fell between them like something she hadn't meant to drop. "I'm sorry, that came out wrong." "No," Margaret said. "I think that came out exactly right." She picked up Clara's bundle of mending and began sorting through it. "I'll have these back to you by end of the week," she said. Clara left, and Margaret worked in silence for a very long time, pressing her hands flat against the table when they trembled, refusing to let the trembling reach anything else. She was 30 years old. She had built something from nothing. She had given this town 8 years of good work and steady presence, and the kind of help that people only notice when it stops. And she was sitting here being told by the person who called herself a friend that she had too many years on her to be worth choosing. She picked up her needle. She put it down again. She walked to the window and looked out at the street. Samuel Carter was crossing the road on the far side carrying a load of fence posts, unhurried, in the particular way of a man who has decided exactly how much energy something requires and is not giving it more or less than that. He didn't look toward the shop. He wasn't looking for her. But she was looking at him, and she was aware, with the slow certainty of something that has been approaching for a while and has finally arrived close enough to name, that the question was not whether Willow Creek would approve of what was happening. The question was what she was going to do about the thing that was already happening inside her own chest. Whether she was brave enough to let it be what it was, or whether she was going to do what she had always done, fold it small, tuck it away, and keep practicing. And that question, the one Margaret stood at her window wrestling with in the summer heat of 1883, was about to be answered by something she hadn't planned for. Because Samuel Carter was carrying more than fence posts that morning. He was carrying the first real threat to everything he had built, and he was about to walk straight into it. The threat that came for Samuel Carter did not announce itself. That was the thing about real danger in Willow Creek. It never came in loud the way you expected it to. It came in quiet. It came in the form of a man in a good suit who smiled too readily and shook hands too firmly and had a way of making you feel in the first 30 seconds of knowing him that he was already 3 steps ahead of you and was kind enough not to say so. His name was Gerald Fitch. He rode into town 4 days after Margaret stood at her shop window watching Samuel cross the road, and he took a room at the Willow Creek Hotel, and he had dinner that first evening with Preston Marsh, the banker Eliza's husband, and they talked for 2 hours over a table in the corner of the hotel dining room, with their heads close together in the particular posture of men who are discussing numbers they don't want overheard. Margaret heard about it from Ruth Peoples the next morning. "Fitch is a land developer out of Denver," Ruth said. "That's what Ellen heard from the hotel girl who serves the dining room. He's been buying up ranch properties all along the Eastern Range, paying good prices apparently. Cash." "What does he want with Willow Creek?" Margaret asked. "There's talk of a rail spur," Ruth said, "coming up from the south. If it comes through the Eastern Range, the land out that way is going to be worth 3 times what it is now." Margaret was quiet for a moment. "The Danner property," she said. Ruth looked at her. "That's what I thought too." Margaret set down her scissors. She thought about the letter she had written for Samuel. She thought about the water rights, the overlapping claims, the complexity she had told him was doable. She thought about the fact that Gerald Fitch was in Willow Creek having private dinners with Preston Marsh, and the fact that Preston Marsh held the note on the Danner property loan that Samuel had taken to finance his purchase, and the fact that a man who bought ranch land for cash and had connections to a potential rail route would have a very particular interest in a property whose water rights were still in dispute. She thought about all of those things in the space of about 10 seconds. Then she went back to work, because none of it was her business. Samuel Carter had not asked for her help beyond the letter to Holt. He was a grown man who had bought a piece of land and presumably understood the risks involved. She was a seamstress who did his mending and gave him the occasional piece of local knowledge that he could have gotten from anyone. She lasted until noon. Then she closed the shop for an hour, something she almost never did in the middle of the day, and she walked to the eastern edge of town where Samuel was working on the fence line with one of his ranch hands, and she told him exactly what Ruth had told her, and she told him what she thought it meant. He listened without interrupting, his hands stilled on the fence post. His face went very still in the particular way of a man who is processing something quickly and does not want to show how quickly. "How sure are you about the rail spur?" he asked. "I'm sure that Fitch believes it's coming," she said. "Whether it actually comes is another matter. But Fitch isn't the kind of man who travels and spends money unless he believes in what he's doing." Samuel looked at the fence post. He looked at the land stretching away from where they stood, rough, requiring work, but with good water access. If the rights could be settled with grazing land, that could support a real operation if someone put in the years. "He's going to come to me," Samuel said. It wasn't a question. "Yes," Margaret said. "And he's going to come before you have the water rights settled, because once they're settled, you'll know what you have. Right now, you don't. Which means you don't know how hard to hold." Samuel turned his head and looked at her with that full, direct attention she was becoming familiar with. "Why are you telling me this?" he asked. It was a fair question. She had asked herself the same one on the walk over. "Because you're the only person who's bought property on the Eastern Range in 3 years and had the sense to come to me for a letter of introduction to a real lawyer," she said. "And I'd rather see you keep what you earned than watch Fitch walk away with it because nobody told you what was coming." Samuel was quiet for a long moment. Then he said, "What would you do if it were yours?" "I wouldn't answer Fitch's first offer," she said. "I wouldn't answer his second one either. I'd get Holt here as fast as possible, and I'd have the water rights documented before I had any further conversation with anyone about the value of this land." He nodded slowly. "And Marsh, the bank." "Pay your note on time," she said. "Don't give Marsh any reason to have a conversation with you about the loan. If he brings it up, be pleasant and be brief and give him nothing to work with. You don't trust Marsh." "I don't trust anyone who has dinner with Gerald Fitch," she said plainly. Something that was almost a real smile crossed Samuel's face. Not the trace of one she'd seen before. Something more present, more alive. "Margaret Hayes," he said. "Yes, you are not at all what this town thinks you are." She looked at him steadily. "I know that," she said. "I've known it for some time." She walked back to town. She opened the shop. She went back to work. But her mind stayed at the fence line for the rest of the afternoon. Gerald Fitch came to the shop on Friday. She had expected he would. Men like Fitch moved through a town systematically. They identified the sources of information early, and in a town like Willow Creek, she was one of the primary ones. Not because she sought that position, but because people talked to her, and people who talked to her talked to each other, and a man who had done his research would know that. He was exactly what she'd expected from Ruth's description. Polished, broad-shouldered, the kind of handsome that has been useful to him and knows it. He came in under the pretense of needing a button replaced on his coat, which was a thin pretense since the coat was clearly new and had all its buttons, and he spent a few minutes establishing a pleasant conversational rapport before he got to anything that actually mattered. "Lovely town you have here," he said. "Quiet, friendly. I can see why people put down roots." "It has its qualities," Margaret said. "I understand the area has been seeing some new investment. New faces. That Carter fellow, for instance. I hear he bought the old Danner place." She looked up from the button she was threading. She looked at him for exactly the amount of time it took to be polite, and no longer. "There's not much I can tell you about Mr. Carter's business," she said. "I do his mending." Fitch smiled. Of course, I only mention it because I'm always interested to meet other men who see potential in an area. It takes a particular kind of vision, doesn't it? To look at a rough piece of land and see what it could be. I suppose so, she said. The Eastern Range especially has been undervalued for years, he said. That'll change. Development has a way of reshaping things. She threaded the needle. She found the matching button in her tray with practiced efficiency. She said nothing. Miss Hayes, he said, and the shift to her name was deliberate, a small move toward familiarity. A door being tested. I hope you won't take this as impertinent, but a woman who's been in a town as long as you have 8 years, I understand, has a sense of things that newcomers can't buy. Who to trust? Who understands how things work? He paused. I'd be grateful for any wisdom you were willing to share. Margaret bit the thread and tied it off. She set the coat on the counter. She looked at Gerald Fitch. The button is secure, she said. That'll be 10 cents. He looked at her for a long moment, and something in his eyes shifted. Not anger exactly. More like recalibration. He had misjudged the approach, and he knew it, and he was deciding very quickly what to try next. He paid his 10 cents. He picked up his coat. It's been a pleasure, he said. I'm sure I'll have more business for you before I leave town. I'm sure you will, she said. He walked out. Margaret stood at the counter and felt the particular cold clarity of having just been in a room with someone who was used to getting what he wanted and was not accustomed to leaving empty-handed. She needed to talk to Samuel. She found him that evening at the Willow Creek feed store loading supplies into his wagon. She didn't waste time on preamble. Fitch came to see me today, she said. Samuel straightened. His ranch hand, a young man named Davis, was still loading sacks at the back of the wagon, and Samuel looked at Margaret, and then looked at Davis and said, "Give us a minute." Davis moved off without question. Margaret appreciated the fact that Samuel had people who gave him a minute when he needed one, which meant he had built a relationship with the people who worked for him that was based on something real. What did he want? Samuel asked. Information, she said. About you specifically. Wrapped in a lot of pleasant conversation about development and vision. She paused. He's careful. He came at it sideways. But he came at it. Samuel was quiet for a moment. What did you tell him? That I do your mending, she said. Nothing else. He looked at her. You didn't have to protect my business interests, Margaret. I know that, she said. I wasn't protecting your business interests. I was being accurate. I don't know your business. I only know what you've told me, which isn't much. She paused. He's moving faster than I expected. He's been in town 4 days. He came to the ranch yesterday morning, Samuel said. She stilled. You didn't tell me. It happened yesterday. I'm telling you now. He said it without defensiveness, matter of fact, but his eyes were watching her carefully. He offered me $8,500 for the property, straight purchase. Margaret did the arithmetic quickly. That's below what you paid. I know that. He knows you know that. Yes, Samuel said, which means the number was a test, not an offer. He wanted to see if I knew what I had. What did you say? I said I'd think about it. He paused. I haven't written to Holt yet. Write tonight, she said. And when you write, tell him it's urgent. Tell him you have a developer in town making inquiries and you need the water rights documented before the end of the month. Samuel leaned against the side of the wagon. He crossed his arms. He looked at her with an expression that was harder to read than usual, not guarded, but interior, like he was having a conversation with himself at the same time he was having one with her. Can I ask you something? He said. You keep asking if you can ask, she said. You can always ask. Why does it matter to you? He said. What happens to my ranch? Why does it matter to you personally? It was the second time he had asked her a version of this question. The first time on the fence line she had answered practically. She had given him the reasonable explanation, the one that sounded like civic-mindedness and local knowledge. She stood in the cooling evening air outside the feed store and looked at Samuel Carter's face and thought about the reasonable explanation. And for the first time in 8 years of being careful, she decided not to use it. "Because you looked at me like a person," she said. "From the first day you walked into my shop. You didn't look at my age or my history. You looked at me. And I can't tell you how long it's been since someone did that without wanting something from me first." She paused. "That matters. So I want you to keep your ranch. Because people who see clearly should be allowed to keep what they built." The silence between them was the specific kind of silence that happens when something true has been said that both people were waiting to hear. Samuel uncrossed his arms. He looked at her for a long moment. "Margaret," he said. And his voice was different, not quieter, but more careful, the way you handle something you don't want to damage. "I want to tell you something." "All right," she said. "I have not talked to a person the way I talk to you in a very long time," he said. "And I need you to know that's not, I want to be honest with you. I came to Willow Creek to work. I came to put my head down and build something and not think too hard about anything else. Because the last time I cared about something too much..." He stopped. "You lost it," she said softly. "I lost her," he said. The word was very quiet, but it landed. "Her name was Anna," he said. "She was 29. It was 4 years ago. There was nothing to be done about it. It just happened. And I moved every year after because staying anywhere too long meant remembering, and I wasn't..." He stopped again. "I wasn't ready to remember." Margaret looked at him. She had heard this before, peripherally, the widower they'd said the man who never showed interest in anyone. But hearing it told plainly in his own voice in the specific weight of her name, Anna was different from the town's version. The town's version was a detail. This was a person. "I understand that," she said. And she said it not as a comfort, not as something you say to fill the silence, but as a truth. She had earned herself the particular understanding of a person who had also learned how to keep moving, so the grief couldn't catch up. "I know you do," he said. And the fact that he knew she understood that he had been paying enough attention to know said more than several long conversations would have. Davis came back around the corner of the wagon with the last feed sack and looked at both of them and then looked at the ground and set the sack down with extreme concentration. Samuel straightened. His voice returned to its regular even register. "I'll write to Holt tonight." "Good," she said. She walked back through town in the dusk. She did not analyze what had happened. She was not ready to analyze it yet. She simply let it be what it was. A conversation between two people who had told each other something true, and she carried it carefully. The way you carry something you don't want to spill all the way back to the shop and upstairs to her small rooms above it, and she made herself dinner and sat at the window and watched the sky go dark. She thought about Anna, who had been 29. She thought about James, who had been 25. She thought about the way grief worked, how it didn't go away. It just became something you carried differently, how you learned to put it down sometimes without losing track of where you'd left it. And she thought that maybe for the first time in 8 years of maybe was worth something. So, the gossip reached her on a Tuesday, which seemed to be the day the town had designated for delivering news that was designed to unhinge her. It came from an unexpected source this time. Not Clara. Not Eliza Marsh. It was Nell Patterson herself, the woman who ran the lunch counter, a person Margaret had always liked. A plain-spoken woman who didn't typically traffic in speculation. Which made it worse somehow that she was the one who said it. "I'm only telling you because I think you should hear it from someone who doesn't mean it unkindly," Nell said. She had come in for her daughter's dress alterations, and she had the look of a woman who had been working up to saying something for several minutes. "There's talk about you and Carter." "I know," Margaret said. "Not just talk about whether there's something happening between you," Nell said. "Different talk. Clara Whitmore told Francis Alderton that the only reason Carter keeps coming back to your shop is because he needs the local connections, that you've been useful to him, for business, and that he's too polite to tell you it's nothing more than that." Margaret's hands did not stop moving. She kept her eyes on the dress. "Clara believes Nell continued, and her voice was not unkind. It was genuinely careful. That once Carter is settled and has his bearings, he'll find a younger woman more suitable, and that you'll be left in an awkward position. Clara is welcome to believe whatever helps her sleep at night, Margaret said. Margaret. Nell? She looked up. I appreciate you telling me. I do. But Clara Whitmore decided 10 years ago what kind of woman I am. And she's been trying to make me into that woman ever since. It doesn't matter what I do or don't do. It wouldn't matter if I were 18. Clara would find a different reason. Nell looked at her for a moment. Are you all right? I'm always all right, Margaret said. After Nell left, Margaret sat for a long time without picking up her work. The thing about Clara's version of the story, the thing that made it work, that gave it its particular cruelty, was that it was almost believable. It was possible. A cynical reading of the last several weeks would support it. A man new to town, needing connections, finding the woman who knows everyone, and using her goodwill to establish himself. It was possible. Margaret knew it wasn't true. She knew it from the way Samuel listened to her, not the listening of a man who is calculating what he can use, but the listening of a man who is genuinely interested in what she's saying. She knew it from the conversation at the feed store. From her name was Anna, from the 3 cents on the counter, from 100 small things that didn't add up to a man running a strategy. But knowing something and not being wounded by the alternative version, those were 2 different things. She was wounded. She could admit that to herself in the private space of her own shop, where no one was watching. She picked up her work. She pressed her hands flat against the table for a moment until they were steady. Then she kept going. What she did not expect was that Samuel already knew. He came in the next morning with the directness she had come to recognize as his particular way of approaching things he wanted to address, not aggressive, not tentative, just straight at it. I heard what's being said, he told her standing at the counter. She looked at him. Which version? That I'm using you, he said. That I come here for information and local standing and nothing more. People say a lot of things, she said. Margaret. His voice was very even. I want to know if you believe it. She looked at him for a long moment. No, she said. I don't. He nodded. He didn't look relieved. He looked like a man who had already assumed this, but wanted to be certain. I need you to keep not believing it, he said, even when it gets louder. And it's going to get louder. Why? Because Fitch made a second offer yesterday, 10,000, still low but closer. He paused. And he made a point of mentioning that he'd spoken with people in town who thought I might be in over my head. That the property was more trouble than it was worth. That a man starting from scratch with a bank loan and complicated water rights would have an easier time selling now than trying to hold on. He's building the case, Margaret said, trying to make you feel isolated. Yes, Samuel said. And whoever's been talking to him. He stopped. Marsh, he said. Marsh has the note on your loan, she said. If Fitch is making offers and Marsh is whispering in his ear about the difficulty of the water rights. They're coordinating, Samuel said. The room went quiet. If Marsh calls the note, Margaret said carefully, before you have the water rights settled. I'd have to sell, Samuel said. Or lose it. He said it plainly. No performance of distress. But the muscle in his jaw moved once, and she understood from that single movement how much this land meant to him. Not just as property, as the specific thing he had decided to stop running and start building, as the first thing in 4 years that he had committed to. Holt is coming next week, Samuel said. Can you make it until next week? The note isn't due for 6 more weeks, he said. Marsh can't call it unless I miss a payment, which I won't. Then next week is fine, she said. Keep paying. Don't negotiate with Fitch. Don't give Marsh anything to work with. She paused. And Samuel, don't come here for a few days. He looked at her sharply. Not because of what's being said, she said quickly. Because if Fitch is watching your movements every time you come here, it tells him something. Let him think you're isolated. Let him think his approach is working. Don't show him your hand. Samuel was very still. He was looking at her with an expression she had not seen before, not the trace of a smile, not the careful attention. Something more open, more exposed. "You're telling me to stay away," he said, "to protect me." "Yes," she said. "And it costs you something to say that." She met his gaze and held it. "Yes," she said again. The silence between them stretched for a long moment. 4 days, he said. "I can stay away 4 days." 4 days, she agreed. He picked up the package of mending he'd come in with and set it on the counter. He paused with his hand on the edge. "Margaret," he said, "when this is done, the Fitch situation, hold all of it. I want to have a real conversation with you, not about water rights." Her heart did something she didn't have a clean word for. "All right," she said. He left. She stood at the counter with her hands flat on the surface and made herself breathe steadily and thought about what it meant, this thing between them, this accumulation of small, true things. And she thought about Clara's voice and Thomas Aldrich's letter and 30 years of being told the story of her life in language that belonged to someone else. And she thought, "I am not afraid of a real conversation." She thought, "I have been waiting for one for years." Yeah. The 4 days were the longest she had spent in a long time. She worked. She filled orders. She paid her accounts. She did all the practical things a practical woman does when she is keeping herself from thinking too hard about something she can't yet control. She smiled at her customers, and she kept her face still when Clara Whitmore came in, and she nodded pleasantly at Eliza Marsh, who looked at her with the particular expression of a woman who is watching a situation with great interest and very little sympathy. And on the 4th evening, Ruth Peoples knocked on the shop door 20 minutes before closing. She had the look of a woman carrying news that is both important and bad. "Samuel Carter's at the hotel," Ruth said. "There's a meeting. Fitch arranged it. Preston Marsh is there too. They've called it a community meeting about development along the Eastern Range, but everyone knows what it really is." "What is it really?" Margaret asked, though she was already taking off her work apron. "They're trying to get the town behind the sale," Ruth said. "Fitch has been going around saying the Carter property is a liability, that the water dispute will end up in court for years and cause problems for everybody in the county. He's calling it a community issue." Margaret folded her apron. She set it on the counter. "Margaret," Ruth said, "half the town is going to be there, and Fitch is very good at what he does." "I know he is," Margaret said. She put on her coat. "What are you going to do?" Ruth asked. Margaret picked up the ledger she kept on the bottom shelf, not her sewing ledger, but the one she had been building quietly for 6 weeks, tracking every piece of public record she could locate about the Danner property, the water claims, the county registration, the timeline of each. She had not told Samuel about the ledger. She had started it without being entirely sure why, because it was the kind of problem she couldn't stop thinking about. Because the solution was there if someone went to the trouble of finding it, and she was a person who went to trouble when something mattered. "I'm going to the meeting," she said. Ruth stared at her. "To do what?" Margaret tucked the ledger under her arm. "To do what nobody in this town expects me to do," she said. She walked out the door, and into the night that was about to change everything. The Willow Creek Hotel meeting room held 30 people comfortably and was holding 43 that evening. Margaret knew this because she counted them as she walked in, not from nervousness, but from habit. She had learned years ago that when you walk into a room where you are not entirely expected, it helps to know exactly what you are walking into. Gerald Fitch stood at the front. He had arranged the room the way a man arranges a room when he wants people to feel they are participating in something rather than being sold. Something, chairs in a loose circle rather than rows at table with coffee. The performance of informality carefully constructed. Preston Marsh sat to his left with the particular posture of a man who is trying to look neutral and is not quite succeeding. Samuel was near the back. He saw her come in. His expression did not change, but his posture shifted a barely perceptible straightening. A kind of alertness, like a man who had been watching a door and is relieved by what finally came through it. She did not go to him. She took a seat on the side of the room near the wall with the ledger on her lap, and she listened. Fitch had started already. He was good, she had known he would be, but seeing it in operation was something else. He spoke the way men with money and intent learned to speak in boardrooms and public halls, in the language of community, and shared interest, every word calibrated to sound like concern, while actually functioning as pressure. The Eastern Range situation is something that affects all of us, he was saying. Water rights in dispute don't just affect the property in question, they create uncertainty for every landowner in the county. I've seen this kind of thing tied up in territorial court for 7-8 years. The costs ripple outward. A man named George Hewitt, who ran the grain supply and had a piece of land bordering the Eastern Range, leaned forward. What kind of costs are we talking about? Legal fees, survey disputes. In some cases, counties have had to step in and renegotiate irrigation agreements from the ground up, Fitch said. He shook his head with the expression of a man who has seen exactly this happen and deeply regrets it. It's not what anyone wants. That's why I believe a clean resolution, a purchase that settles the ownership question and moves the property forward under a single consolidated ownership, is in everyone's interest. You mean your interest? Samuel said from the back of the room. The room went quiet. Fitch turned toward him with the smooth pivot of a man who had been waiting for the interruption and had a response already waiting. Mr. Carter, he said pleasantly, I'm glad you're here. I want to be clear, I don't benefit from conflict. A smooth transaction benefits the community. You benefit by acquiring land at below value before a rail spur drives the price up, Samuel said. His voice was level. Completely level. That's not a community benefit. That's a business strategy. Fitch's smile didn't waver. I can see you've heard the railroad speculation. I want to be careful not to. Is there a rail spur planned for the Eastern Range? George Hewitt asked, suddenly sharper. He looked between Fitch and Marsh. Because if there is, that affects my land too. There have been preliminary conversations, Fitch said carefully. Nothing confirmed. It would be irresponsible to... Either there are conversations or there aren't, Samuel said. Mr. Carter. Marsh spoke for the first time, his voice carrying the particular weight of a man who controls something important and wants the room to remember it. I think what Mr. Fitch is trying to establish is that the responsible path forward, the responsible path, Margaret said, is to present accurate information to the people in this room. Every head turned toward her. She had not planned to speak yet. But Marsh's voice had that quality. The smoothing over quality, the let's not trouble ourselves with specifics quality, that she had been watching operate in this town for 8 years, and she was done watching it operate unchallenged. Fitch looked at her. The smoothness in his face adjusted, not dropping exactly, but recalibrating in the way it had in her shop when she'd charged him 10 cents and given him nothing else. Miss Hayes, he said, I didn't realize you had a stake in Eastern Range property. I don't, she said, but I have a stake in accurate information, and I've been paying attention to the Danner property situation for some time. She opened the ledger on her lap. The water rights dispute on that property is real, but it's not unresolvable. There are 3 overlapping claims. The primary claim, the one that carries the most legal weight, was registered with the county in 1871, predating the secondary claims by 6 years. That documentation exists in the county land office. It was never properly presented to the commission because Horace Danner was not a man who liked lawyers and refused to pay for one. The room was very still. That claim, she continued, if properly documented and submitted, resolves the central dispute. The secondary claims become subordinate. That process with a competent attorney takes approximately 2 months, not 7 years. Fitch looked at her with an expression that was no longer the performance of pleasantness. It was the face underneath, calculating and sharp, and not particularly warm. And how exactly, he said, does a seamstress come to have that level of familiarity with county land records? Because Horace Danner was a customer for 6 years, she said, and I listened. She closed the ledger, which is apparently more than anyone else in this room did. The silence held for a long moment, And then George Hewitt laughed a short, genuine sound and said, "Lord, she's right. I remember Danner going on about those claims. Said he had paperwork that settled the whole thing, but couldn't be bothered to file it." "The paperwork is in the county land office," Margaret said. "I confirmed it 2 weeks ago by mail. An attorney named Holt in the county seat has already been contacted and is coming next week to review it." Marcia's face had gone the color of old chalk. Fitch said very quietly, "You've been preparing for this." "I've been paying attention," she said. "There's a difference." Samuel caught up with her on the street outside. The meeting had dissolved not dramatically, but with the deflated quality of a strategy that has been publicly dismantled. Fitch had stayed pleasant on the surface, right up until he left, which told Margaret that he wasn't finished, that a man like that didn't absorb a setback in a public room and simply stop. But tonight, the room had heard something they couldn't unhear. "Margaret." Samuel's voice was urgent in a way she hadn't heard from him before. "You've been building that case for 2 weeks and you didn't tell me." "You didn't need to know while it was still incomplete," she said. She kept walking. "If I'd told you, and it turned out the documentation wasn't there, you'd have relied on something that didn't exist. That's not—" He stopped. He walked beside her for a moment in silence. Then he said, "You didn't tell me because you were protecting me from a potential disappointment." "I was being practical," she said. "Margaret." She stopped walking. She turned and looked at him in the dark of the street, the lamplight from the hotel window catching the side of his face, and she saw something in his expression that undid her careful practicality completely. He wasn't angry. He wasn't even frustrated. He was looking at her with something that was almost wonder. Not the performative wonder of a man trying to compliment a woman, but the genuine variety, the kind that happens when someone shows you what they're made of, and you realize you had underestimated the quantity. "Nobody has done something like that for me," he said. "In a very long time, maybe ever." She looked away. "Don't make it more than it is," she said. "I did it because it needed doing." "You did it for me," he said. "You can call it practical all you want. You did it because it mattered to you that I kept what I earned." She didn't answer. Because he was right. And admitting he was right meant admitting what that meant. And she wasn't ready. Not on a dark street outside the hotel with Fitch possibly watching from a window, and Clara Whitmore possibly watching from across the road, and 30 years of being told she was too much of this and not enough of that, pressing against the inside of her chest like something that needed room and hadn't been given any. "Go home, Samuel," she said. "Let Holt do his work. Keep paying your note. This isn't over yet." "I know it isn't," he said. "That's not what I'm talking about." She looked at him. "I know," she said softly. She walked home. Holt arrived on a Wednesday. He was a small, precise man with wire-rimmed glasses and the economical manner of someone who charged by the hour and had decided long ago that wasted words were wasted money. He came first to Samuel's ranch and spent 3 hours there going through what Samuel had, and then, at Samuel's request, he came to Margaret's shop. She had the ledger ready. She walked him through every entry, every record, every piece of documentation she had traced and confirmed. He listened without interrupting, which she appreciated, and when she was done, he sat back and looked at his own notes for a long moment. "This is thorough," he said. He said it the way Holt said most things, with the flat effect of someone who does not offer compliments freely and therefore means them when they come. "Is it sufficient," she asked, "to establish the primary claim?" "Yes." He tapped his pen against his notebook. "There'll be a commission hearing, probably 4 to 6 weeks out. Fitch may try to file a counterclaim to delay. That's the usual play." "Can he succeed?" "He can delay," Holt said. "He can't win. The 1871 registration is clean." He paused. "Someone needs to testify at the hearing. About the documentation, the chain of custody, the nature of the overlapping claims. Mr. Carter can speak to his purchase, but the historical context—" He looked at her. "I'll testify," she said. Holt nodded as if this had never been in question. He picked up his notebook. "I'll file this week. Mr. Carter," he said, turning to Samuel, who had been standing quietly near the window throughout. "Keep current on your loan obligations. Don't engage with Fitch directly. If Marsh contacts you about anything other than scheduled payments, send him to me." He shook their hands, Margaret's first, then Samuel's, and left. Samuel stood in the empty shop after Holt's departure with his hat in his hands, turning it slowly. "You said you'd testify," he said. "Someone needs to establish the historical record," she said. "That means standing in front of the commission and saying everything you know, and having Fitch's lawyer try to discredit you," he said. He said it not as an objection, but as a statement of what was true. "They'll come at you, Margaret. On your qualifications, on what right you have to be there." "I know that," she said. "And," she looked at him steadily, "and I've been having my right to be somewhere questioned by people who don't know my value for most of my adult life," she said. "I'm not particularly afraid of a commission hearing." Something moved across his face, complicated and deep, the way a shadow moves when the source of light shifts. "Margaret Hayes," he said quietly. "What did this town do to deserve you?" She felt heat rise in her face, actually rise, which hadn't happened to her in so long she had almost forgotten the sensation. She turned back to her counter and made a business of straightening things that didn't need straightening. "They didn't deserve anything," she said. "I just happened to be here." The days between Holt's visit and the commission hearing were the hardest. Not because of the legal situation that was proceeding the way Holt said it would proceed, which was slowly, and with the grinding administrative thoroughness of territorial bureaucracy, but steadily. The counterclaim from Fitch's attorneys came in exactly as predicted, citing procedural objections to the 1871 registration that Holt described when he telegraphed to report it as creative but meritless. The hard part was the town. Fitch had been working it. Quietly, the way he did everything, not loudly enough to be confrontable, but thoroughly enough that Margaret felt it everywhere she went. He had spoken to the right people. He had framed the situation in terms that were designed to make Samuel look like an obstacle to progress, and Margaret looked like there was no clean word for it, like a woman who had overstepped, like a woman who had inserted herself into men's business because of some personal attachment that clouded her judgment. Clara Whitmore said it to her face on a Thursday afternoon with the specific kind of directness that people use when they have decided that kindness and honesty cannot coexist. "People are saying you made yourself look foolish at that meeting," Clara said. "That you spoke up for a man who hasn't made you any promises and never will. That you've let yourself get carried away." "Let myself get carried away," Margaret repeated. "It's what people are saying." "Clara." Margaret set down her work and looked at the woman she had known since girlhood, and thought not for the first time about the distance between knowing someone and understanding them. "Do you actually believe that? Or are you just passing along what you heard?" Clara was quiet for a moment. Then she said, "I'm worried about you." "That's kind," Margaret said. "But I need you to hear something." She kept her voice level. Not angry, something past anger, something cleaner. "I went to that meeting because I had information that the people in it deserved to have. I put that information in front of them because it was true, and because without it, a man who built something honestly was going to lose it to a man who bought properties by manufacturing uncertainty. I did not do it to make a statement about my personal feelings. I did it because it was the right thing to do." She paused. "And if people want to read something else into that," she said, "that is their limitation, not mine. I am done apologizing for knowing things and acting on them." Clara stared at her. For a long moment, something shifted in Clara's face. Something that might, under different circumstances, and in a longer lifetime of friendship, have grown into a real reckoning. But Clara was not a woman who reckoned with herself in front of other people, and so what happened instead was that she picked up her mending and said she hoped it would all work out and left. Margaret went back to work, but her hands trembled for a moment before they steadied. Samuel came to the shop that evening. He did not pretend it was for supplies or mending. He simply came and knocked on the door after hours, and when she opened it, he stood on the step and said, I heard about Clara. Word travels fast, she said. In this town it does. He paused. Can I come in? She stepped back from the door. He came in, and she closed it, and the shop in the evening light was different from the shop in the day. Quieter, smaller, more honest somehow. He stood with his hat in his hand, and she stood at the counter, and neither of them said anything for a moment. Then he said, I need you to know something. All right. What I said on the street after the meeting, he said. About it mattering to me, about nobody having done that for me in a long time. He was looking at her directly the way he always looked at things he was taking seriously. I didn't say that because I was grateful for the legal help. I said it because I've been sitting with it for 2 weeks, and I haven't been able to say it the right way yet. And tonight, I heard someone made you feel like you overstepped on my behalf, and that's wrong, and I need to. He stopped. He put his hat on the counter. He ran his hand through his hair in a way that was so human, so unguarded, that it made him look for just a moment like a man who had no practiced version of himself to fall back on. I'm not good at this, he said. Good at what? She said softly. Saying the thing, he said. The real thing. I was good at it once before. He stopped. I got out of practice. She waited. I want to have dinner with you, he said, not as a way of thanking you, not as anything except what it is, which is that I want to spend an evening with you where we're not talking about Fitch or Marsh or water rights or what this town thinks. He paused. I want to know what you think about when you're not thinking about any of those things. The shop was very quiet. Margaret looked at him for a long moment. She thought about Thomas Aldrich's letter burning in the stove. She thought about Clara's voice, and Eliza Marsh's eyes, and Ruth Peoples saying he's a widower with that careful gentleness. She thought about 30 years of being measured against a standard she had never agreed to. She thought about all the time she had kept her face still when her hands wanted to tremble, all the time she had folded herself small and practical and unreachable, because reaching meant risking, and she had not been able to afford risk. She thought about how long she had been doing that, and she thought enough. Sunday, she said. I close the shop at noon on Sundays. Samuel picked up his hat from the counter. He held it. He looked at her with something in his face that was not the trace of a smile, or the steady attention, or the complicated interior expression. It was simpler than all of those. It was relief. The particular relief of a man who has been carrying something heavy and has finally been allowed to set it down. Sunday, he said. He left. Margaret stood alone in the shop for a long time after one hand flat on the counter. She was not afraid. That was the thing she noticed most. She was nervous genuinely. Physically nervous the way she hadn't been about a personal thing in years. But under the nervousness was something solid. Something that did not shake. She had made a decision. Not from desperation, not from loneliness, not because someone had finally offered and she was afraid to refuse. From choice. From the specific, clear-eyed choice of a woman who knew exactly what she was doing and why. That was different from anything that had come before. Sunday came. They ate at the table in the back of Margaret's shop, the table she used for cutting fabric cleared and covered with a cloth she had hemmed herself with food. She had cooked that morning and a jar of wildflowers. Ruth Peoples had left on the shop step without explanation, which Margaret suspected meant Ruth knew exactly what Sunday lunch was and was being quietly, fiercely supportive. It was the most ordinary meal imaginable, and it was the least ordinary afternoon of Margaret's life in a very long time. Samuel told her about Texas, about growing up on his father's ranch, about the particular education of a boy who learns work before he learns books and spends years trying to reverse that balance. He told her about the cattle drives, the years of motion, the way a man can fill up years with forward movement so thoroughly that he forgets movement isn't the same as direction. He told her about Anna, not the fact of her. He had told Margaret the fact of her already on the street outside the feed store. He told her the real version. The woman who had laughed at him when he was too serious, who had kept a garden in soil that was not really suited to it, and had refused to acknowledge that fact, who had been 29 years old and full of the particular confidence of a person who assumes they have many decades ahead in which to do things, and who had been wrong about that, and who had left behind a kind of quiet that Samuel had spent 4 years trying to outrun. Margaret listened. She did not offer comfort. She did not say the things people say when they don't know what else to say. She just listened, and when he was done, she said, "She sounds like someone who knew what she wanted." "She did," he said. "So do you," she said. "Most people don't." He looked at her. "What do you want, Margaret?" She thought about it honestly. Not the answer she would have given to anyone else, the practical answer, the careful answer. The honest one. "I want to stop being careful," she said. "I want to stop measuring everything I do against what the town expects. I want to build something with someone who sees me as I actually am, not as what they've decided I should be." She paused. "I want to travel. I've never been east of the Kansas border. I want to see things I haven't seen." "You've never said any of that to anyone," he said. "No," she admitted. "Why not?" "Because someone always had a ready answer for why those things weren't realistic," she said. "And it's easier not to mention your dreams than to have someone explain to you why you shouldn't have them." Samuel was quiet for a moment. Then he said, "I'm not going to do that." "I know," she said, and the knowing of it, the certainty that she had read him right, that this was not a man who would minimize her, or manage her, or reduce her to something convenient, was almost more than she could hold quietly. "Margaret," he said, and the way he said her name now was different from the first weeks. It was used to itself, comfortable, like a word you've said enough times that it starts to feel like it belongs in your mouth. "I want you to know something. Whatever happens with the commission, whatever Fitch does next, whatever Marsh tries." He stopped. "I bought that ranch because I wanted to stop running. But I came back to your shop every week because you gave me a reason to want to stay somewhere." She looked at him across the table. "That's a significant thing to say," she said. "Yes," he said. "I know it is." "We've known each other 8 weeks," she said. "I know that too." She was quiet for a moment. "I'm not in a hurry," she said. "I don't need it to be anything it isn't yet." She met his eyes. "But I need you to know that I am not doing this from loneliness. I am not doing this because you're the first man in years who's been kind to me. I'm doing this because I think you're one of the most honest people I've met in my adult life, and that is genuinely rare, and I am not going to pretend I don't know the difference." Samuel's face did the thing that was past the trace of a smile. The real thing, present and alive. "That is the most direct thing anyone has said to me in years," he said. "I told you," she said. "I'm done being careful." They talked for another 2 hours. When he finally rose to leave, he picked up his hat and stood for a moment at the door, that same doorway where he had paused on his very first visit. One hand on the frame, not quite committed to entering or leaving. "Next Sunday," he said. "Next Sunday," she said. He left. Margaret sat at the table in the fading afternoon light and let herself feel the fullness of what was happening without immediately finding a practical way to describe it, without reducing it to something manageable. She just let it be large the way it actually was. She was still sitting there when the knock came at the door. Not a polite knock, the hard, urgent kind. She opened it. Davis Samuel's ranch hand stood on the step, hat in hand, breathing fast. "Miss Hayes," he said. "Sorry to bother you, but Mr. Carter sent me." He paused. "Marsh came out to the ranch an hour ago. Said the bank is calling the note early." Margaret stared at him. "On what grounds?" she said. "Said there's a clause. Something about property value being in dispute affecting the collateral. Said if Carter can't pay the full amount by the end of the month." Davis shook his head. 12 days, Miss Hayes." 12 days. Holt's commission hearing was in 4 weeks. Margaret stood in the doorway with the evening air cool against her face and thought very quickly, very clearly about what 12 days meant and what it didn't mean and what exactly had to happen now. "Tell Mr. Carter to come here first thing tomorrow morning," she said, "early, before the shop opens." "Yes, ma'am." "And Davis." She looked at him. "Tell him not to panic. Tell him I said this isn't over." Davis nodded and went. Margaret closed the door. She stood in the quiet shop and her hands did not tremble. She went to her desk and pulled out her writing paper. Not the good kind this time. The working kind. The kind you use when you have a great deal to do and very little time to do it. She had 12 days. She began to write. She wrote 4 letters that night. The first was to Holt explaining Marsh's move with the note clause and asking him to examine the loan document Samuel had signed. She told Holt exactly what she suspected, that the clause was real, but that its application in these circumstances was a stretch, the kind of stretch that only works if the person being stretched doesn't know enough to push back. She asked him to respond by telegraph as soon as he had reviewed it. She asked him to do it fast. The second letter was to a woman named Frances Delaney in the county seat, a woman Margaret had helped 8 years ago when Frances's husband had left her with 3 children and a contested property claim, and whom Margaret had quietly assisted in finding the right people to talk to. Frances had since remarried a county commissioner. Margaret had never asked her for anything. She asked now. Not for the outcome, she was careful about that, careful to ask only for access, only for a fair hearing at the correct level, but for confirmation that the commission hearing could be expedited if the circumstances warranted it. The third letter was to George Hewitt. He was the man at the community meeting who had laughed when she cited the 1871 documentation. He had land on the Eastern Range. He had a stake in what happened to the water rights. And he was, she had observed over the years, a man who responded to facts rather than pressure, the kind of person who was not easily moved by Fitch's methods because he had been around long enough to recognize them. She asked George Hewitt if he would be willing to speak at the commission hearing about what he knew of the Danner property's history. She told him it would take 1 afternoon of his time, and that his testimony would be straightforward, only what he personally witnessed, and knew nothing more. The fourth letter was the hardest. It was to Samuel, not about the legal situation, not about Holt or Marsh or what happened next. She had already dealt with that in 3 letters. This one was personal, and she almost didn't write it, and she wrote it anyway because she had decided she was done being careful, and being careful had always meant, most of all, not saying the things that mattered while they still had time to matter. She wrote, "I need you to know that what I am doing is not something I am doing for you. I am doing it with you. That is a different thing entirely. A woman who does things for a man is a woman who needs his gratitude. A woman who does things with a man is a woman who has decided she is his equal. I have decided I am your equal. I hope that is acceptable to you." She folded the letter. She put it in an envelope. She set it on the corner of her desk, where she would either give it to him tomorrow morning or put it in the stove, depending on how much nerve she had at first light. She went upstairs. She did not sleep well, but she slept. Samuel arrived at 6:30 before the town had properly woken up. She had coffee ready. She had Holt's reply already. He had been at his telegraph office late, which told her he had taken the urgency seriously, and she put it in front of Samuel before she said anything else. He read it standing at the counter. She watched his face. The clause Marsh had cited was real, a property value dispute clause buried in the loan terms that gave the bank the right to call early payment if the collateral's assessed value fell below a threshold. Holt had underlined the relevant section and added 3 words in the margin: arguable but possible. "He can do it," Samuel said. "He can try," Margaret said. "Read the next paragraph." Samuel read. Holt had done more than confirm the clause. He had also noted that the same clause contained a condition that the bank was required to provide a formal assessment from a licensed county assessor before invoking it, and that assessor could not be someone with a financial relationship to any party seeking to acquire the property. "Fitch and Marsh are coordinating," Margaret said, "which means Marsh can't use an assessor with any connection to Fitch. That narrows his options considerably. How long does that process take? 3 to 5 weeks minimum if it's done correctly." She met his eyes. "Which pushes it past the commission hearing." Samuel set the letter down. He looked at her. "You already figured this out last night," he said. "I had some thoughts," she said. "Margaret." His voice was quiet but full. "How long did you work last night?" Until about midnight, she said. He said nothing for a moment. Then he said, "Why didn't you send for me? I should have been part of this." "You would have been," she said. "But you were upset, and I work better when I'm not managing someone else's emotions at the same time." She said it without apology. "Now you're here, and you're calmer, and we can work together on what comes next." He accepted that. She had noticed early on that Samuel was a man who could accept a correction or an honest observation without it requiring him to respond to it, which was rarer than it should have been. "The fourth letter," she said. She picked up the envelope from the corner of her desk and held it for a moment. Then she put it down. "We'll talk about that later. Right now, tell me the note." "What's the exact amount outstanding?" he told her. She had known it would be significant. She had not known it would be exactly as significant as it was. She kept her expression steady. "All right," she said. "Here's what we're going to do." What they did over the next 3 days was methodical and unglamorous, and required the kind of sustained, careful work that doesn't look dramatic in the doing, but constitutes the actual substance of how real problems get solved. Holt sent a formal response to the bank challenging the application of the clause on the grounds of the assessor conflict. Marsh's attorney replied. Holt replied to the reply. Margaret read every exchange that Holt forwarded to her, and twice she caught language that needed tightening, and wrote to Holt with her observations, and both times he incorporated them without comment, which she took as the highest form of professional acknowledgement available from a man of his temperament. George Hewitt wrote back on the second day. He would testify. He had, as it happened, more to say than Margaret had realized. He had seen Danner's original documentation himself years ago, when there had been a brief and quickly dropped challenge to the irrigation agreement between their two properties. He had seen the 1871 registration with his own eyes. He could speak to that directly. Margaret wrote back and told him his timing was excellent. Francis Delaney's response came on the third day. The commission could hear an expedited case if the circumstances included active financial pressure on a party in an ongoing dispute, which they did. The hearing was moved up, 3 weeks instead of 4. When she told Samuel, he sat very still for a moment. 3 weeks, he said. 12 days less than 4 weeks, she said. Which means Marsh can't complete an assessor process before the hearing, even if he starts one today. He'll figure that out, Samuel said. Yes, she said. He will. And when he does, he's going to try something else. She paused. We need to be ready for something else. Samuel looked at her. What do you think he'll try? She had been thinking about this since the previous night, worrying at it, the way she worried at a complex alteration, examining every angle, every seam, every place something could pull apart under pressure. He'll try to discredit the 1871 record, she said. Not with the assessor, differently. He'll find someone to raise questions about the documentation's legitimacy, whether it was properly witnessed, whether the survey it references is accurate. She paused. He'll try to make the primary claim look uncertain enough that the commission tables the hearing. Can he do that? He can try to do that, she said, which is why we need someone who can testify to the physical document before he gets the chance to cast doubt on it. She paused. George Hewitt saw it. That's one person. I need another. Samuel was quiet. He was doing what she recognized as his thinking, that interior stillness that looked from the outside like rest but was actually work. Danner had a daughter, he said slowly. She left Willow Creek before he died, married a man in Pueblo. He paused. She came back once when he was sick. She and I crossed paths briefly at the general store. She mentioned the property. She was frustrated. She said her father had everything he needed to settle his affairs and was too stubborn to do it. Margaret looked at him. She saw the documentation. I think she did. Do you know her name? Eleanor. Eleanor Webb now, I think. He paused. I don't know if she'd come back. I'll write to her, Margaret said. You don't know her. No, Margaret said. But I knew her father, and sometimes that's enough of a starting point. She was already pulling out paper. What do you remember about her? What she looked like? What she said? Samuel told her. She wrote the letter that afternoon, and it was the kind of letter she was good at, specific, plain, not asking for more than what was needed, explaining exactly what the situation was, and what Eleanor Webb's testimony would contribute to resolving it. She did not exaggerate. She did not appeal to sentiment. She explained what was true, and asked for help, and said why the help mattered. She sent it by the evening post. Fitch made his next move on a Thursday. It wasn't what Margaret had expected, which was the first sign that she was dealing with a man who was more adaptive than she had given him full credit for. He didn't go after the documentation. He went after her. Not directly, that would have been too obvious, too confrontable. He went after her the way he did everything, which was through other people, through the careful placement of questions and suggestions that accumulated into a picture he wanted people to see. She heard it first from Nell Patterson, who came in Thursday morning with the look of a woman who has been awake in the night deciding whether to say something. Fitch has been talking to people, Nell said. About you, specifically. She paused. He's been suggesting that your involvement in the Carter situation, the meeting, the letter to the commission, that it constitutes a conflict of interest. That you have a personal relationship with Carter that makes your testimony compromised. Margaret set down her work. He's right that I have a relationship with Mr. Carter, she said carefully. I'm not going to pretend otherwise. He's suggesting it's more than that, Nell said. He's suggesting that you're... She stopped. That you're motivated by personal attachment rather than facts. That a woman in your position, after all these years without... She stopped again. Without a man, Margaret said. Nell's face was pained. He's saying you'd do anything for Carter because you're desperate. Those are not my words. The shop was very quiet. Margaret thought about the word desperate. She turned it over. She examined it the way she examined a piece of fabric with a flaw, looking at it from every angle, to understand exactly what it was and where it came from, and what you were actually dealing with. Desperate was what men like Fitch called women like her, when they couldn't find anything else. It was the last resort of a man who had run out of real arguments. It was designed to make her feel ashamed of the very thing she had finally decided to stop being ashamed of: her age, her solitude, her desire. She thought about the fact that Fitch had figured out the right weapon after all, not the documentation, her. Thank you for telling me, she said to Nell. I mean that. After Nell left, she sat at her work table and did not pick up anything for several minutes. Because it was working. She could feel it working. Not in her own resolve that was solid in a way that surprised even her. But she could feel it in the way the town had been looking at her the last 2 days. The slight shift. The recalibration. The way eyes moved away a fraction of a second sooner than they had before. Fitch had taken 8 weeks of careful observation and used it as a blade. And the blade was sharp. She was still sitting there when Samuel came in. He took one look at her face and said, "What happened?" She told him. All of it. Without softening it, without managing his reaction in advance, just plainly what Fitch was saying, what word Nell had reported, what she thought it meant for the hearing. Samuel's face went through several things while she talked. She watched it happen. The first thing, which was anger controlled, but present, visible in the set of his jaw. The second thing, which was something more complicated, more interior. The third thing, which settled. He's trying to get you to pull back, Samuel said. From the hearing, from all of it. Yes, she said. Are you going to... She looked at him. No. Good, he said. The word was quiet but absolute. He was quiet for a moment. Then he said, Margaret, I need to say something, and I need to say it right. All right, she said. I know this situation has put you in a position you didn't ask for, he said. I know you started helping me because it was the right thing to do, and it became something else, and now someone is using what it became as a way to undermine what you know. And I need you to know. He paused. He was finding the words carefully, the way he did when something was important enough to get right. Whatever happens at that hearing, whatever Fitch says about you, I don't want you to be in that room defending yourself because of me. I want you to be in that room because you chose to be there, as yourself, not as my whatever they want to call you. Nisso. She looked at him for a long moment. And if they call me your woman, she said, not challenging, asking. He held her gaze. Then I'd hope you'd consider whether that was something you objected to, he said, because I wouldn't. The room was very still. Margaret felt something give way inside her, not collapse, not break, but release. Like a knot that has been pulled so tight for so long that when it finally loosens, you have to relearn how to hold the rope. Samuel, she said. Yes. Don't say things like that and then stand across a counter from me, she said. He came around the counter. He stood in front of her, and he was close enough that she could see the specific line of worry still around his eyes. The exhaustion of 3 weeks of legal maneuvering and financial pressure and watching a town argue about his right to keep what he'd earned. And she understood that all of it, the ranch, the water rights, Fitch Marsh, all of it had required him to be steady and strategic and contained. He reached out and took her hand. Just that. Her hand in both of his, with the calloused care of a man who works with his hands and has learned that the same hands can be gentle. I'm not going anywhere, he said. That's what I should have led with. I'm not going anywhere. She did not cry, but it was a near thing. Neither am I, she said. Eleanor Webb's reply arrived on a Saturday 6 days after Margaret had sent the letter. It was 2 pages long and written in the cramped, decisive handwriting of a woman who had a great deal to say and had been waiting for someone to ask. She had seen the documentation. She had seen it with her own eyes multiple times, the last time 3 years before her father died. She knew exactly where her father kept it, in a tin box in the county land office, not in his home, because he had been paranoid about fire. She had tried after his death to have someone retrieve it, and had been told by Marsh's bank, that there were outstanding debts against the estate that needed to be settled before any property documentation could be released for review. Margaret read that sentence 3 times. Then she read it a 4th time. Marsh had known about the documentation. He had known it was in the county land office. He had known it settled the water rights question. And he had used the estate debt as a reason to prevent anyone from accessing it, which meant that for the past 4 years, he had been sitting on the information that would have resolved the dispute and keeping it buried, because a resolved dispute was worth less to him than an ongoing uncertainty. She went very still. Then she got up and went to find Samuel. She found him at the ranch. She walked in without waiting to be announced, and Davis, who had seen her arrive, simply pointed toward the barn and made himself scarce with the tact of a young man who had learned something about when to make himself scarce. Samuel came out of the barn when he heard her. He read her face before she said a word. "What is it?" he said. She handed him Eleanor's letter. She watched him read it. She watched the moment when he reached the Marsh section, the slight change in his posture, the stillness. "He knew," Samuel said. "He knew," she said. "He's known for 4 years. That's not just conflict of interest." Samuel's voice was level, but very quiet. "That's fraud." "Yes," she said. "This changes the hearing." "It changes everything," she said. "This isn't just a water rights dispute anymore. This is a banker deliberately suppressing documentation to manufacture a property dispute in coordination with a developer looking to acquire undervalued land." She paused. "Holt needs this letter today." Samuel was already moving. "I'll ride to the telegraph office. I'll write the summary for Holt," she said. "He needs to understand what this means before he reads the letter. The letter alone is a family member's account. The letter in context of everything we've documented is evidence." They worked for the next 2 hours at Samuel's kitchen table, him telegraphing her writing, Davis riding back and forth to town with messages. By evening, Holt had the letter and the summary, and had sent back a reply that was for Holt almost effusive. "This materially alters the case." Come prepared to expand the hearing scope. Well done. Margaret folded Holt's telegraph and put it in her coat pocket. Samuel set down the last of his correspondence and looked at her across the table. Marsh is going to know this is coming, he said. Yes, she said. When Holt files the expanded scope, Marsh's attorney will see it. Fitch too. Yes. Samuel leaned back. He looked at the ceiling for a moment. They might try something before the hearing. I know, she said. Which is why we're not going to do anything differently between now and then. Pay the note on time. Don't engage with either of them. Walk into that hearing with everything documented and let Holt do his job. You make it sound simple. It's not simple, she said. It's just clear. He looked at her. Are you afraid? She thought about it honestly. I was afraid of this town for years, she said. I was afraid of what they thought of me and what they said about me, and whether I was taking up too much space by simply existing here on my own terms. She paused. I'm not afraid of that anymore. I'm focused. There's a difference. What changed? He asked. She met his eyes. I stopped apologizing, she said, for knowing things, for being here, for wanting things. She paused. For you. Samuel looked at her for a long moment, with the full present attention that she had come to understand was his version of saying something important. I haven't thanked you, he said. You don't need to thank me, she said. Not for the legal work, he said, for... He stopped, started again. For making this place feel like somewhere I'm supposed to be. I haven't felt that anywhere in 4 years. He paused. I needed you to know that. She nodded once. She did not trust herself to say more than that, in that moment, in that kitchen, with the evening coming in through the windows, and all the accumulated weight of the past weeks sitting between them, like something real and fragile and worth protecting. Get some sleep, she said. We have 10 days until the hearing. He walked her out. At the door to the ranch, he held it open, and she stepped through, and he said, Margaret. She turned. The letter, he said. The one on your desk that first morning. The one you decided not to give me. She stared at him. Davis saw it, he said. He mentioned there was an envelope on the corner of your desk that you looked at, and then didn't pick up. He paused. I've been thinking about what might be in it. She said nothing for a moment. Then she said, I'll bring it to the hearing. He nodded. She left. The 10 days moved, the way that days move when you are managing something consequential fast and slow simultaneously, each individual hour long and the total distance short, so that when the morning of the hearing arrived, it felt both inevitable and sudden. Margaret dressed carefully that morning. Not because she needed the town's approval of how she looked, she had moved past that, or was moving past it. The way you move past a thing that has been in your road for a long time. Incrementally and without ceremony. She dressed carefully because this was important, and she respected important things enough to show up to them properly. She took the ledger. She took Eleanor Webb's letter copied into a clean document that Holt had formally notarized. She took her own written account of every conversation and piece of research she had contributed to the case, also notarized, because she had learned that in rooms where people wanted to dismiss a woman having the paperwork in order was the first and most necessary thing. She took the envelope from her desk. She put it in her coat pocket. She walked to the courthouse. Samuel was already there. He was standing in the hallway with Holt, who was talking at him with the rapid compressed efficiency he used when he had a great deal to communicate in a short time. When Samuel saw Margaret, he stopped listening for a moment, just long enough to look at her with the full present attention that she now recognized as his most honest face. She walked to them. Holt gave her a nod that contained approximately 12 words of professional respect compressed into a single gesture. Ready, he said. Yes, she said. Marsh is here, Holt said. Fitch is not. His attorney is. He paused. They know what's coming. Marsh looked like a man who hadn't slept. Good, Samuel said quietly. Margaret, Holt said, you testify third, After Hewitt, after me. They will challenge your standing to testify. I'll handle the standing objection. When they get to the substance, the documentation, the timeline, your knowledge of Danner's affairs, be specific. Dates. Details. Don't editorialize. Just tell them what you know and how you know it. I understand, she said. They went in. The hearing room was plain and smelled of paper and old wood, and the specific institutional seriousness of territorial legal proceedings. The commission sat at the front, three men, none of whom Margaret had met. Preston Marsh sat to one side with his attorney. Fitch's attorney sat nearby. George Hewitt was already there, looking like a man who had decided to do something and had committed to it fully. Margaret sat and felt the room around her, the weight of it, the formality. The fact that what happened in this room in the next few hours would determine whether Samuel kept the thing he had come back for, whether Marsh and Fitch's coordination was exposed for what it was, whether the town of Willow Creek had to reckon with the fact that a woman who did mending had quietly assembled a legal case that none of the men in suits had seen coming. She felt the envelope in her coat pocket. She felt Samuel beside her, not touching, but present in the way a person can be present when their attention is fully, genuinely on you. She breathed. She was ready, and she was not afraid. The first witness was George Hewitt. He took his place with the unhurried confidence of a man who had lived 60 years in the territory and had learned that the truth, stated plainly and without decoration, was the most durable thing a person could bring into a room. He spoke about Horace Danner, the way men speak about difficult neighbors they nonetheless understood, with the particular mixture of exasperation and respect that comes from sharing a fence line with someone for 20 years. He had seen the documentation. He said so directly. He named the date, the occasion, the specific circumstances, a water dispute between his own property and Danner's in 1876 that had been resolved in an afternoon when Danner produced the tin box from the county land office and showed him in his own kitchen the 1871 registration that settled the question before it had time to become a real argument. He remembered the surveyor's name on the document. He remembered the county seal. He remembered Danner saying, with the blunt satisfaction of a man who knows he's right, "Nobody's going to take this water from me as long as I've got this paper." The commission listened. They asked 3 questions. Hewitt answered each one without elaboration, without retreat. Fitch's attorney, a man named Carver, smooth and practiced in the way of men who spend their lives making complicated things sound simple, cross-examined him for 12 minutes and produced nothing useful. Hewitt was not the kind of witness who could be maneuvered. He knew what he knew, and he said it, and he did not drift from it. Margaret watched Marsh during Hewitt's testimony. Marsh had the look of a man watching something he thought he had buried walk back into the room. His face was controlled. He was a banker. Controlled was professional requirement. But there was something underneath the control that she had seen before, on people who had made a miscalculation and were only now understanding the full dimension of it. He had not known about Hewitt. She could see that. Good, she thought. Holt went second. He presented the legal framework with the brisk architectural precision that was his native language, the timeline of the water rights dispute, the chain of documentation from the 1871 original registration through the subsequent overlapping claims, the specific grounds on which those secondary claims were subordinate to the primary. He cited case precedent from 3 territorial hearings. He presented the formal documentation from the county land office, retrieved 10 days ago by a process server with Holt's written authority and Eleanor Webb's written authorization as the heir of Horace Danner's estate. The tin box, it turned out, had been exactly where Eleanor said it was. The 1871 registration was exactly what everyone said it was. Clean, complete, properly witnessed and sealed. Marsh's attorney objected twice. Holt addressed each objection with the calm, detailed efficiency of a man who had anticipated both of them and prepared responses in advance. The commission conferred briefly. They overruled both objections. Margaret felt Samuel exhale beside her, not a sigh, not a release of tension he'd been showing. Just the single breath of a man who has been holding something in and is allowing himself one moment of not holding it. Then Carver stood up. The commission should be aware, Carver said, that there is a question of standing regarding the next witness. He looked at Margaret with the particular kind of look that is not quite contemptuous, but is designed to be read as contempt from a safe distance. Miss Hayes is a seamstress. She has no legal training, no property interest in the matter before this commission, and her involvement in compiling the case documentation represents an apparent personal conflict of interest, given her relationship with the property claimant. He paused on relationship in a way that was designed to let the words sit and spread. Holt was already standing. Miss Hayes will testify as a fact witness, Holt said, regarding her direct knowledge of the property's history, her conversations with the property's previous owner, and her independent research into county land records. Her standing to testify to facts she directly witnessed is not a legal question. It is simply a question of whether she knows things relevant to this proceeding. She does. He paused. As for conflict of interest, the commission will note that Miss Hayes has no financial stake in this property, holds no claim against it, and stands to gain nothing material from the outcome. The same cannot be said for Mr. Carver's client. One of the commissioners, the one in the center, a man with a gray beard and the measured eyes of someone who had heard a great many arguments and had learned to distinguish the real ones from the performances, said, "The objection is noted. The witness may proceed. This commission will assess the weight of her testimony accordingly." Carver sat down. Margaret stood up. She walked to the front of the room, and she felt for a fraction of a second what the room wanted her to feel: the weight of being scrutinized, of being measured, of being a woman in a space that was not designed with women in mind and did not quite know what to do with her presence. She felt it the way you feel cold air when you walk outside as a real physical thing. Information your body is registering. She registered it, then she set it down. She looked at the commission. 3 men who did not know her. 3 men who were going to have to decide in the next 20 minutes whether what she knew was worth listening to. "My name is Margaret Hayes," she said. "I have operated a business in Willow Creek for 8 years. Horace Danner was a customer of mine for 6 of those years. I am going to tell you what I know from direct experience, and I am going to tell you how I know it, and I am going to give you documentation for every piece of it." She opened the ledger. She talked for 19 minutes. She was specific. She was precise. She moved chronologically through everything she knew. Danner's conversations in her shop, the details he had shared about the water claims, the fact that he had spoken of his documentation with the certainty of a man who knows he has what he needs and has simply not gotten around to using it. She addressed the timeline of the overlapping claims and why the secondary claimants had never pressed their cases despite the apparent opening created by Danner's death. She addressed the county land office records, the chain of custody of the tin box, and the specific sequence of events that had prevented anyone from accessing the documentation after Danner died. And then she came to Marsh. She turned to the specific section of Eleanor Webb's notarized letter, and she read it aloud, the part about the estate debt, the part about the bank, the part about being told the documentation could not be released for review. The room changed. It was a subtle change, not noise, not movement. The kind of change that happens in the quality of attention in a space when something important has been said and everyone is recalibrating around it. Marsh's attorney started to rise. The center commissioner raised one hand. "Sit down, please." Carver sat. The commissioner looked at Margaret. "Miss Hayes, you're suggesting that the bank holding the property loan was aware of the existence of documentation that resolved the water rights dispute and took action to prevent that documentation from being accessed. I'm presenting a notarized account from Eleanor Webb, the heir of Horace Danner, that describes exactly that sequence of events," Margaret said. "I'm not characterizing it. I'm giving you the record of what happened and leaving the characterization to this commission." The commissioner looked at the letter. He looked at his colleagues. Something passed between the 3 of them in the way of men who have been doing a job together long enough to communicate without speaking. He looked at Marsh. "Mr. Marsh," he said, "your attorney may want to advise you before this commission asks you any direct questions." Marsh's face had gone the color of old plaster. Carver leaned in and said something close to his ear. Marsh said something back short and sharp. Carver said something else. Then Carver stood and said, "The bank reserves its right to address these claims in a subsequent proceeding and declines to respond at this time." The center commissioner nodded once. "Noted." He looked at Margaret. "Thank you, Miss Hayes. That will be all." She walked back to her seat. Samuel did not say anything. He put his hand over hers on the armrest for 1 second only, brief and deliberate, and then withdrew it and looked forward again. It was enough. The commission deliberated for 45 minutes. Margaret sat in the hallway with Samuel and Holt and George Hewitt, and the waiting had the quality that waiting always has, when you have done everything you can do and the outcome is no longer in your hands. Holt reviewed his notes. Hewitt talked to Samuel about the spring grazing schedule in a conversational, unhurried way that Margaret understood was a kindness, something to put the mind somewhere manageable, while the body waited. She sat with her hands folded on the ledger and thought about Thomas Aldrich's letter burning in the stove, and about Clara's voice saying years like it was a wound, and about the 8 years she had spent in Willow Creek, being seen as something smaller than she was. She thought about Samuel saying, "I'm not going anywhere." She thought about the envelope still in her coat pocket. Carver came out of the hearing room, once glanced at them without expression, and went back in. Marsh did not come out at all. At the 43-minute mark, the clerk opened the door and called them back in. The center commissioner read the ruling. The 1871 registration was valid and primary. The secondary claims were subordinate and non-actionable. The water rights dispute on the Danner property on Samuel Carter's property was resolved in favor of the primary claim. The commission further noted in language that was careful and formal, and nonetheless unmistakable in what it was doing, that the circumstances surrounding the suppression of the Danner estate documentation warranted referral to the Territorial Attorney General for review of potential misconduct by the lending institution. He said that last part without looking at Marsh. He didn't need to. Holt made a sound beside her that was the closest thing to satisfaction she had ever heard from him, a short compressed exhale that contained an entire editorial. Samuel was very still. Then he said quietly to no one in particular, "All right, just that. All right." 2 words that held everything: the relief, the exhaustion, the 4 years of moving before this, and the 12 weeks of holding still, and the thing he had decided to build when he bought a neglected piece of land on the eastern range of Willow Creek, because he had finally decided he was done running. George Hewitt shook his hand first, a solid grip with the directness of a man who does things properly. Holt shook it next and said something about filings and timelines that Samuel nodded at without fully hearing, which Holt accepted with the understanding of a man who knew when the legal part of a conversation was over. Carver left without speaking to anyone. Marsh left through a side door, and Margaret sat in her chair for a moment longer than everyone else, letting the room settle around her, letting the outcome be real before she stood up and walked back into the ordinary world, where all of this had to be lived with going forward. Samuel came and stood beside her chair. "Margaret," he said. She looked up at him. "Come outside," he said. Chang. The street outside the courthouse was ordinary in the way that streets are ordinary on days when something extraordinary has just happened inside the building they run past. People were going about their business. A wagon was moving. Somewhere a dog was barking at something it considered important. Samuel stood beside her and looked at none of it. "Tell me about the letter," he said. She reached into her coat pocket. She took out the envelope. She held it for a moment. Then she gave it to him. He opened it. He read it standing there on the courthouse step, and she watched his face the way she had watched his face over the past 12 weeks. Not searching for a reaction she wanted, but genuinely watching the way you watch a face. You have come to know well enough to read its smallest movements. He read it twice. Then he folded it carefully. He put it in his breast pocket. "I'm not going to tell you that you wrote that wrong," he said. "I know I didn't," she said. "No," he said. "You didn't." He looked at her. "You said you're his equal. You were right." "I know that too," she said. Something moved across his face, the complicated interior expression that had taken her weeks to understand, was not distance but depth, not withdrawal, but consideration, the face of a man who was deciding whether to say the thing fully or to hold some of it back. He said it fully. "I want to ask you something," he said, "and I need you to answer it the way you answer everything honestly, without managing it for what you think I want to hear." "All right," she said. "Do you see a future here?" he said. "Not the ranch, not what's been settled today. I mean us. Do you see it clearly? Because I see it clearly. And I've been seeing it clearly for about 6 weeks, and I didn't want to say it before the hearing, because I didn't want it to be tangled up in everything else. I didn't want you to wonder later whether you said yes to me or yes to the situation." She looked at him for a long moment. "Samuel," she said, "I have been running my own business for 8 years in a town that spent most of those years trying to make me feel like I was living wrong. I have buried a husband and turned down men who thought my age was a liability and built something from nothing while people told me I was too old and too independent and too comfortable alone to be worth choosing." She paused. "I know the difference between a situation and a man. I have known it for a long time." "And," he said, "and I see it clearly," she said. "I've been seeing it clearly since you put 3 cents on my counter and made me laugh with it." The real smile came then, not the trace of one, not the suggestion, the full thing present and lit, transforming his face into something she wanted to look at for a very long time. "That's all I needed to know," he said. The news moved through Willow Creek the way significant news always moves faster than it should, carrying more heat than the facts alone would generate, arriving at every door with the accumulated commentary of everyone it had passed through on the way. The hearing outcome was public record, and that much traveled cleanly. The water rights were settled, the Carter property was secure, the bank had been referred for review. That part traveled fast and went in mostly one direction. The rest of it, the part about Margaret, about what she had done and how she had done it, about the woman who had walked into the commission hearing with a ledger she had built quietly over 6 weeks and dismantled a developer's strategy and exposed a banker's misconduct in 45 minutes of testimony, that part traveled differently. It traveled with a kind of friction. It required people to update something they had been told for a long time, and updating things you have been told for a long time is uncomfortable work, and people in Willow Creek were not uniformly willing to do it. But some of them were. Nell Patterson was the first. She stopped Margaret on the street the afternoon of the hearing with no pretense and no preamble and said, "I heard what you did in that room today. I want you to know I'm proud of you." She said it the way Nell said things, simply without sentiment, dressing it up. That made it more valuable, not less. George Hewitt told 3 men at the feed store that evening that Margaret Hayes had done more careful work on that case than anyone he'd hired for any legal matter in 20 years, and that anyone who still thought of her as only the town seamstress needed to revise their understanding. He said it without apparent awareness that it was an extraordinary thing for him to say, which made it more extraordinary. Even Ruth Peoples, who had been quietly supportive all along in her sideways fashion, came into the shop the next morning and set a jar of preserves on the counter and said, "I just wanted to bring you something," and was unable to articulate anything beyond that, but managed to convey a great deal. Clara Whitmore did not come. Margaret did not expect her to, and she had made her peace with that. There were some reckonings that took time. There were some distances between people that had been built gradually enough that they couldn't be closed quickly. She did not require Clara's approval to feel settled in what she had done. She had stopped requiring that of the town some weeks ago, and the freedom of that, the lightness of having set it down, was something she was still getting used to. 2 weeks after the hearing, Marsh resigned from the bank. He didn't announce it publicly. He was simply one day no longer there, and his replacement was a man from the county seat who came in and conducted the first 3 weeks of his tenure by reviewing every outstanding loan in the institution with the thoroughness of a man who had been told something was wrong and was determined to find out how wrong. Fitch left Willow Creek the same week Marsh resigned. His attorney filed a withdrawal of the counterclaim on the water rights without explanation or comment. Fitch himself sent no communication to anyone, which Margaret considered the most honest thing he had done since arriving. The Territorial Attorney General's office sent a letter to the courthouse requesting documentation. Holt handled the response. Life in Willow Creek settled back into its ordinary rhythms, which is what small towns do. After upheaval, they absorb the event. They incorporate the new knowledge into the existing structure, and they continue. What had changed was not visible in the street or in the buildings or in any tangible thing. What had changed was something in the ledger of what the town knew about itself and about the people who lived in it. And Margaret Hayes was one of those people, and the town knew her differently now. Not perfectly, not completely, not without the residue of 8 years of whispers and judgments and well-meaning diminishments that had accumulated like sediment, but differently, more accurately. As a woman who had not been waiting for rescue, who had never needed rescue, who had known her own value clearly and patiently through every year the town had declined to acknowledge it. That was not nothing. That was in fact a great deal. Samuel came to her on the last Sunday of September with his hat in his hands, and she recognized the posture, the same posture as the first day he'd stood in her doorway, one hand on the frame, not quite committed to entering. She had come to understand that this was what he looked like when something mattered enough that he wanted to do it right. "I have something to ask you," he said. "I know," she said. He looked at her. "You know, you've had something to ask me for about 2 weeks," she said. "You keep starting and then deciding it isn't the right moment. I've been waiting." He stood very still for a second. Then the corner of his mouth moved. "Am I that obvious?" he said. "To me," she said. "I don't think to anyone else." He came inside. He did not sit down. He stood at the counter the way he had stood there 100 times in the past 3 months, except that this time he was not holding a piece of mending or a list of supplies or a legal document or any of the practical things that had given the visits their official reason. He was holding nothing, just himself. "I am not a man who does this gracefully," he said. "I want to be upfront about that. I had this whole thing worked out, and now I'm here and you're looking at me and I can't remember any of it." "Samuel," she said. "Yes." "Say the actual thing," she said. He looked at her. "Marry me," he said. Just that. Not a long speech, not a construction of reasons and qualifications and careful framings. 2 words direct and undecorated in the voice of a man who had decided something and was saying it plainly. Margaret looked at him across the counter. She thought about the 30 years that had led to this moment, the 22-year-old who had married James with the specific hope of youth, the 24-year-old who had stood in this town's judgment and chosen to stay anyway, the 30-year-old who had burned Thomas Aldrich's letter and kept working and refused for all those years to become the diminished thing the world wanted to make of her. She thought about all the ways she had been told that this moment was not available to her, that she was past the age for it, that a woman who knew herself too well and stood too straight and required too little was not the kind of woman a man chose. She thought about Samuel Carter, who had walked into her shop looking for a mending job and had looked at her, really looked with the full attention of a man who understood that looking was a commitment and had not looked away since. She thought about 3 cents on the counter, and her name was Anna, and I'm not going anywhere, and a Sunday afternoon at a table covered with a hemmed cloth, and 2 people telling each other things they had not told anyone else. "Yes," she said. The word was quiet and absolute, and it closed 8 years of holding her breath in 1 syllable. Samuel reached across the counter, and she took his hand, and neither of them said anything else for a moment, because there was nothing else that needed saying. 1. They married in November, beneath the old oak on the ranch property that Samuel had learned from Holt's thorough review of the water rights documentation was the same tree that had marked the survey boundary on the 1871 registration. It was the oldest thing on the land. It had been there before Danner, before the dispute, before any of the human argument about who owned what. It had simply grown through all of it, unhurried and indifferent to the claims people made around its roots. Margaret thought that was fitting. There was no large ceremony. They had not wanted one. Ruth Peoples was there, who had been quietly, ferociously supportive from the beginning. George Hewitt was there, who had shaken Samuel's hand at the hearing and had been a decent and honest presence in everything since. Holt was there briefly because Samuel had asked him, and because Holt, under the economical precision of his professional manner, had a genuine investment in outcomes that were correct, and this one was correct. Davis was there because he had ridden back and forth to the telegraph office in the urgent days before the hearing more times than should have been asked of anyone, and had done it without complaint. Eleanor Webb was there. She had come from Pueblo for the hearing and had stayed 2 weeks afterward to see the property settled and the documentation filed correctly. She and Margaret had talked for hours over those 2 weeks about Danner, about the ranch, about what Eleanor remembered of the land from her childhood. She had her father's blunt directness and her mother's practicality, and she had, somewhere in the years of living in Pueblo, with her husband and her children, developed the particular clarity of a woman who had left one life and built another, and was not confused about what each one had cost. When she heard about the wedding, she had delayed her return home by 4 days to be there. She stood next to Margaret before the ceremony, and she said, "My father would have liked you. He liked people who paid attention." "He paid attention himself," Margaret said, "to the things that mattered to him." "The land," Eleanor said. "The land," Margaret agreed. "And to knowing what was his." Eleanor nodded. "That's a good way to know your life," she said. "Knowing what's yours." Margaret looked across the yard to where Samuel was talking to George Hewitt, with the ease of two men who have come to respect each other in the specific way of men who have been tested in the same fire and come through it with their character intact. She looked at the way he stood on this land, the particular groundedness of a man who has finally found the place where he was supposed to be and knows it. "Yes," she said. "It is." 10. Clara Whitmore came to the shop 3 weeks after the wedding. She came in the morning before the other customers, and she stood at the counter with her hands around a bundle of mending, and an expression that had in it something Margaret had not seen on her face before. Not warmth, not the performance of warmth, but something rawer. Something that had been worked toward. "I owe you an apology," Clara said. Margaret looked at her. "Not for any one thing," Clara said. "For the whole of it, for the years of it." She paused. "I told myself I was being realistic, that I was protecting you from disappointment. But I was—" She stopped. She started again. "I was afraid of you. I've been afraid of you since we were girls. Because you always seemed to know what you were, and I never felt like I did." Her voice was very quiet. "It was easier to tell myself you had missed something than to admit that I didn't understand what you were doing." The shop was very quiet. Margaret looked at Clara, the woman she had known most of her life, the woman who had delivered Thomas Aldrich's letter with 2 careful fingers, and said years like an accusation, and come to the shop again and again, with the particular mixture of genuine care and genuine fear that Margaret had never been able to fully separate from each other because they had always come together. She thought about what forgiveness actually was. Not the performance of it, not the "it's all right" that smoothed things over and required nothing but the real work of it, which was acknowledging that something had happened and choosing not to let it be the last thing. "I know," Margaret said. "I've known for a long time." Clara looked at her. "You're not going to make this easy, are you?" "I never made anything easy," Margaret said. "You said so yourself." Clara's face did something complicated, and then unexpectedly, genuinely, she laughed. A short, real sound. The first one Margaret had heard from her in a very long time. "No," Clara said. "You never did." Margaret took the bundle of mending. She set it on her table. "I'll have these back by Friday," she said. Clara left. It was not a complete repair. Years of small cruelties don't resolve in one conversation, and Margaret was not a woman who pretended otherwise. But it was a beginning. And a beginning, she had learned, was not nothing. A beginning was, in fact, everything. The shop changed in the year that followed. Not dramatically, not all at once, but in the particular way that things change when the person at the center of them has changed the same work, the same tables and shelves and tools, but inhabited differently. Margaret had never hidden in the shop. But she had been for years smaller in it than she was. More careful, more contained. She was not contained anymore. She took on 2 apprentices in the spring girls of 17 and 19 who had ability and no clear path for it, and she taught them the work with the same practical directness that had characterized everything she did. And with the additional thing she had learned more recently, which was that a woman teaching another woman was one of the most important things that happened quietly in the world, and it was worth doing properly. She told them what she knew. Not just about mending and alterations and the specific technical knowledge of fabric and thread. She told them how to keep their own accounts. She told them how to read a contract. She told them that the customers who bargained dishonestly were the customers not worth keeping, and that knowing their own value was the first and most necessary professional skill they would ever develop. They listened. The older one, a girl named Kate, with her mother's red hair and her father's stubbornness, listened with the specific hunger of someone who has been waiting for this information and didn't know it until it arrived. Margaret recognized that hunger. She had felt it herself once in a different shop, in a different time, before she had learned to supply her own answers. Samuel came by in the evenings. The shop was between the town and the ranch, and he had made it his habit in the way that people make habits of things that matter to them naturally, without ceremony, as though it had always been how the day ended. He would come in, and she would still be working usually, and he would sit across from her table, and they would talk about the day in the easy way of 2 people who have been paying attention to each other long enough that conversation is not work. He was building the ranch into what it had the potential to be. The water rights were clear. The land was responding to care the way neglected things respond when care arrives gradually, then noticeably, then impressively. He had taken on 2 hands in addition to Davis, and he spoke about the work with the specific contentment of a man who is exactly where he decided to be. He did not speak about running anymore. One evening in the spring, he came in later than usual, and he stood in the doorway the way he still sometimes did, that trace of the original posture. The man who had learned to commit to doorways, but still remembered not committing, and he said, "I got a letter today." "From who?" she asked. "An old friend in Texas," he said. "Inviting me back down for the summer. Said there's good work down there." He paused. He didn't know about the ranch, or about you. Margaret looked at him. "What did you write back?" "That I found somewhere to be," he said. She looked at him across the work table in the evening light. "Just that," she said. "I told him about you too," he said. "I told him I married a woman who walked into a commission hearing with a ledger she'd built from scratch and took apart 2 men's fraud in 45 minutes of testimony, and that I was not going anywhere that she wasn't." Margaret felt the warmth of that settle through her. Not the nervous warmth of the early weeks, but something deeper. The warmth of a thing that has been there long enough to be trusted. "That was accurate," she said. "I try to be accurate," he said. She smiled. "I know you do." Why? Years later, when people in Willow Creek told the story, and they did tell it the way all good stories eventually become part of the place where they happened, they told it in layers. The first layer was the legal story, the developer who came to town and lost the banker who suppressed documentation and resigned the water rights dispute that turned out to have been resolvable all along, if anyone had simply done the work of resolving it. The second layer was the love story which people told with the slightly embellished warmth that time and repetition give to things that were already good. The lonely cowboy and the woman. The town had written off the shop with the bell above the door. The 3 cents on the counter. The hearing where she walked in with a ledger and changed everything. The third layer was the one that took the longest to arrive at, the one that required the most honesty to tell. It was the layer about what the town had done and not done, about the years of whispers and the letters, and the years said like a wound, and the particular diminishment that comes when a community decides a woman has exceeded her usefulness and acts accordingly. Not everyone could tell that layer yet, but enough people could, and Margaret, when she heard the stories, which she did because Willow Creek was a small town, and you heard everything, eventually did not correct the embellishments. She let the story be what the town needed it to be, the love story and the legal victory, and the cowboy who saw what everyone else missed. She knew the fuller version. She had lived it. She had been the woman the town stopped seeing, and she had gone right on being herself through all of it. And then one Tuesday, a man had walked through her door and looked at her. Really looked. And the world had turned on that small, enormous thing. She had not been rescued. That part the story sometimes got wrong. She had been seen. And the difference between those two things was the whole of it. Samuel Carter had not chosen her despite her years or her independence or her inconvenient competence. He had chosen her because of every single thing. She was the full 30 years of her, the buried husband and the built shop, and the 8 years of keeping her face still and her hand steady, the ledger compiled from nothing and the hearing won on facts alone, and the 2 apprentices she was teaching to know their own value before anyone else tried to assign it for them. He had chosen all of it, and she had chosen him, his 4 years of running and his grief named Anna, and his careful way of looking at things before he judged them, and his 3 cents, and his truth, and the specific, genuine, unperforming love of a man who had decided at last to put his weight down somewhere and let it be held. They had chosen each other. That was the whole story. Not because they needed each other to be complete, they had each been complete in the particular, imperfect, hard-won way of people who have survived things and kept going. But because 2 people who see clearly choosing to walk together with their eyes open and their hands steady and their hearts honestly held out between them, that was not completion. That was something better than completion. That was the story that was still going. And it would go for a very long time. Because love does not have an expiration date, and a woman's worth does not diminish with the years, and the greatest thing a person can do in a world that tries to make them small is to remain patiently and completely and without apology, exactly who they are until the right person comes through the door, looks across the counter, and finally, at long last, sees them whole.